It started subtly. At first, it was just small lapses, moments where I'd walk into a room and forget why I was there, or start a sentence and completely lose my train of thought. I chalked it up to stress, to lack of sleep, to the usual excuses people make when their mind feels a little foggy. But then I started losing time. I'd check my phone and realize an hour had passed in what felt like minutes. I'd go to bed at midnight and wake up to find it was suddenly late morning, my alarm never having gone off, with no memory of turning it off myself. There were times when I'd be in the middle of a conversation, and suddenly it was as if someone had pressed fast forward. I was sitting in a completely different place, mid-sentence, with no recollection of how I got there. The strangest part was that no one else seemed to notice. Friends, co-workers, even my family acted like everything was fine. But I knew something was wrong. The first time it truly scared me, I was in my apartment watching TV. One moment I was flipping through channels, and the next I was sitting in the dark, the screen black, my hands clenched into fists. My heart was hammering in my chest as I checked my phone. 3 hours had passed. I had no memory of anything during that time. No dreams, no thoughts, just a void. My body felt strange, like it had been used while I wasn't present. Then I started waking up in places I didn't remember going to. Once, I found myself sitting in a diner 2 towns over, a cup of coffee in front of me, half drunk, my wallet open on the table. The waitress smiled at me like we'd been talking, but I didn't know what about. "You okay?" she asked. "You kinda zoned out for a second." I nodded, played along, paid my bill, and left. But inside, I was screaming. I checked my phone later and found a text I didn't remember sending, to an unknown number. It simply read, "I'm here." The people in my life began acting strange too. Conversations I was sure I'd seemed to vanish from their memories. My coworker asked if I was coming to her party on Friday, even though we'd talked in detail about it the day before and I'd told her I couldn't make it. When I reminded her, she just frowned. "No, we didn't talk about that," she said, shaking her head. "You said you'd be there." Even my reflection seemed off. I caught myself staring at it in the bathroom mirror one morning, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly disconnected from the person looking back. It wasn't that my reflection was wrong, it was that I felt like the wrong one. I leaned closer, studying my own face, and felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. My lips moved before I could think, whispering, "Who are you?" I hadn't meant to say that. The words slipped out like they had come from somewhere else. I stumbled back, my breath shallow, my mind racing. Was I losing it? Was I sick? I tried to tell myself it was stress. Maybe I was sleepwalking. Maybe I was just tired. Then one night, I woke up standing in my own living room. The lights were off, and I was facing the front door with my hand on the lock, as if I had been about to leave. My phone was on the coffee table, screen glowing with a message from the unknown number. Not yet. I don't remember falling asleep. I don't remember getting up. But I stood there, my hand still gripping the lock, staring at that message for what felt like hours. The next day, I called my mother just to hear a familiar voice. "Hey," I said when she picked up. "I just wanted to check in." She hesitated. "You called me this morning, remember? We talked for a while." My stomach twisted. "No, I didn't." A long silence. Then she laughed nervously. "Very funny. You sounded kind of weird, actually. Kept asking if I remembered things. Then you hung up out of nowhere." I barely mumbled an excuse before ending the call. I checked my phone records. There was a call, 32 minutes long. I didn't remember a single second of it. The more I tried to make sense of what was happening, the worse it got. I started recording myself at night, just to see what I was doing while I slept. The first few nights, there was nothing, just the sound of my breathing. But then, on the 4th night, I woke up with my laptop open in front of me, a text document full of sentences I didn't recognize. Some were half-finished thoughts. Others were just wrong. Repetitive phrases like, "I don't want to leave yet. I don't want to leave yet. I don't want to leave yet. It's not me, it's not me, it's not me." In one sentence near the bottom, typed perfectly, "Don't check the camera." I did anyway. The footage was mostly normal, until around 3:47 a.m. That's when I saw myself sit up in bed, move to my desk, and start typing. But my posture was wrong, stiff, almost mechanical. And then, at one point, I turned to face the camera. My head tilted slightly, and I smiled. But I wasn't looking at the screen. I was looking directly into the lens. Like I knew I was being watched. I slammed the laptop shut and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I don't know how long this has been happening. I don't know if it's getting worse or if I'm just becoming more aware of it. I don't know if I'm losing time or if something else is taking it from me. I started to wonder if I was ever really in control or if I just believed I was. And worst of all, I've stopped checking my phone at night because I know, deep down, that I'll see another message from that unknown number. And this time, I'm afraid it'll say now. I remember it like it was yesterday. Even though it happened over a decade ago, the memory remains seared into my mind. It began on an ordinary winter night, the kind where the chill in the air forces you to pull your coat tight, and you settle in for what you expect will be a quiet evening at home. I was living alone in a modest apartment on the outskirts of a small town, a place that everyone said was peaceful and safe. I just finished dinner, put on some soft music, and was reading in bed when I heard a faint, deliberate knock at my front door. At first, I assumed it was nothing more than the wind tapping against the window or a branch scraping the frame. But the knocking persisted, slow, methodical, almost as if someone was testing the sound. My heart began to race as I rose to check the door. I peered through the peephole and saw nothing but the empty hallway, its fluorescent lights buzzing quietly. I locked the door and tried to convince myself it was just my imagination running wild in the quiet of the night. Yet, throughout the rest of that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The sensation was subtle at first, a prickle on the back of my neck, the fleeting shadow of movement in the corner of my eye. But it grew steadily more insistent. Over the next few weeks, strange occurrences began to punctuate my otherwise routine life. I'd return home from work to find minor disturbances. A book slightly out of place on the coffee table, a door that wasn't fully closed, or the soft sound of footsteps echoing in the empty corridors of my apartment building. One evening, after a long, stressful day, I sat down to watch a movie only to have the TV flicker and then abruptly shut off. When I tried to turn it back on, it remained stubbornly dark. I chalked it up to a power surge in an old building. Yet the feeling of unease lingered like a dark cloud. The most unsettling incidents, however, weren't confined to my apartment. While out for an evening walk, I began noticing the same man in different places, a figure who seemed, at first glance, entirely ordinary. I'd catch a glimpse of him standing at the bus stop under the glow of a street lamp, or sitting silently on a park bench as if waiting for someone. At first, I convinced myself it was pure coincidence, a local resident who happened to share my routine. But then, one day, I saw him outside a local diner where I was grabbing a late snack. He was sitting alone in a booth near the window, watching me intently. When I made eye contact, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and then turned his gaze back to his untouched coffee. I tried to rationalize his presence. Maybe he was simply a regular like me, or perhaps a friendly face I'd seen around before, but never really noticed. However, the encounters grew more frequent and the details more disturbing. Not only did he appear in places where I would be, but he also seemed to know things about my day. On one occasion, while waiting for the bus on a rainy night, I heard him say to a stranger on the bench, "I bet you were at that new cafe today," even though I hadn't mentioned it to anyone. His voice was calm, almost friendly, yet there was something deeply disconcerting about his accuracy and timing. The turning point came one particularly frigid night. I was working late at the small office where I'd taken a part-time job to help pay rent. The building was nearly empty, and I was the last one to leave. As I gathered my belongings, I noticed a figure lingering by the entrance, a man in a dark coat whose face I couldn't clearly make out in the dim light. I felt an inexplicable urge to hurry, but when I reached the elevator, I realized the man had followed me inside. The doors closed with a soft ding, trapping us together in a confined space. I tried to ignore him, but his presence was overwhelming. He didn't speak, yet his eyes held a piercing intensity that made my skin crawl. When the doors opened on the ground floor, he stepped out silently, disappearing into the night as if he had never been there at all. That encounter shattered any remaining sense of normalcy. I became hyper-aware of every creak in my apartment, every rustle of leaves outside my window. I installed a small security camera by my front door, hoping to capture any further incidents. Yet the footage only deepened the mystery. On several nights, I reviewed the recordings and saw fleeting images of a man standing just outside, too brief to identify, yet unmistakably human. I even received a series of strange, untraceable text messages that read simply, "I know, and I'm always near." I couldn't understand who could possibly know so much about me, and why. Friends and family tried to reassure me that I was overreacting, that the mind sometimes plays tricks when you're alone in the dark. But I knew what I experienced was not a trick. It was real. I remember the overwhelming terror of one cold December evening when, after a particularly unnerving day, I locked all the doors and windows, sat in the dark, and listened as faint footsteps circled my apartment. I clutched my phone until my hands trembled, my mind racing with unanswerable questions. No logical explanation ever emerged. There were no break-ins, no signs of forced entry, only the unmistakable feeling that someone, somewhere, was deliberately invading my space. Now, years later, I still question what happened that winter. The rational part of me wants to believe it was a series of unfortunate coincidences, a combination of my overactive imagination, the isolation of a cold, lonely season, and perhaps a few random acts by a curious stranger. But every time I think back to those nights, to that relentless, suffocating feeling of being watched, I know deep down that it was something more. I never did find out who that man was or why he chose me. And every time I pass a darkened window or hear a faint knock in the dead of night, I can't help but feel that he might be out there, waiting for the next moment to reveal himself. This isn't a story I fabricated for shock value. It's a real, terrifying experience that left an indelible mark on my life, one that still defies explanation. I share it not only to unburden my own memories, but also as a cautionary tale. Sometimes, the most ordinary nights hide the darkest secrets, and no amount of logic can ever truly explain why such events occur. I know what I experienced was real, and I live with the lingering question of why every day. It started on a damp autumn evening when I was driving home from a late shift at work. The roads were slick with rain, and the world outside my windshield was a blur of shimmering reflections. I'd taken a shortcut through an industrial area on the outskirts of town, a route I'd used many times without incident. But that night, something was off. As I navigated the deserted road, I noticed a figure standing by the side of the highway under a flickering streetlight. He was dressed in a dark, hooded jacket that seemed to swallow the light around him. His eyes, barely visible beneath the shadow of his hood, locked onto mine as if he were studying me intently. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowed down, unsure if he needed help or if I was witnessing something sinister. I rolled down the window slightly and called out a hesitant greeting, but the only response was a slow, deliberate nod. Before I could react further, he stepped back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. The encounter left me rattled. I tried to dismiss it as a trick of the light or an overactive imagination fueled by exhaustion. But in the days that followed, similar oddities began to surface. At first, they were trivial, misplaced items, like the set of keys I was sure I'd left on my kitchen counter now mysteriously found on the dining table, or a book I'd been reading that later appeared open to a page I never reached. I chalked these up to simple carelessness or the weariness of long workdays. Yet there was a nagging feeling that these were not mere coincidences. One evening, I found myself waiting in line at a nearly empty grocery store. As I reached for an item on a shelf, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned to see a man in a worn trench coat with an expression that was both vacant and unsettlingly familiar. He didn't say a word, just stared, his eyes fixed on mine. I managed a weak smile and moved on, but the image of his unblinking stare haunted me. Later that night, while I was alone in my apartment, I thought I heard footsteps pacing in the hallway outside my door. I peered through the peephole, but saw nothing. Only the reflection of my own anxious eyes in the dim corridor light. The situation escalated when I began noticing discrepancies in the memories of those around me. At work, I mentioned my unsettling encounters and even described the man in the trench coat. To my surprise, a co-worker casually remarked that he'd seen a similar figure loitering near the building, though he insisted it must have been a prank or an overactive mind. Another colleague told me a story about a strange man who had asked him oddly specific questions about his personal life, details that the man shouldn't have known. I started to wonder if I was being drawn into a larger pattern, one that I couldn't piece together. Then came the night that shattered any lingering hope for a rational explanation. I returned home from a friend's place, the chill in the air growing sharper as I walked the empty streets. The usual hum of city life was absent, replaced by an eerie silence punctuated only by the distant sound of dripping water. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "I see you." My blood ran cold. Every instinct screamed that I was being watched, pursued by a presence that was as elusive as it was menacing. I quickened my pace, my breath coming in ragged gasps, as I darted into a narrow alleyway in a desperate bid to lose whoever might be tracking me. In that moment, time seemed to slow, and every shadow became a potential threat. I finally reached my apartment building, heart hammering, and fumbled with my keys at the door. Once inside, I double-checked every lock and creak of the old floorboards. The silence in my small living space felt heavy, almost as if it were trying to communicate a warning. I barely slept that night, the echo of every distant footstep and whispered sound amplifying my anxiety. In the following days, I started to see glimpses of that hooded figure in unexpected places. A dark reflection in a shop window, a fleeting shadow crossing a busy street, even in the blurry corners of crowded events. It wasn't just me. Others began recounting similar encounters, though always with an odd hesitance, as if admitting such experiences was dangerous. I confided in a close friend about everything that had been happening, hoping for reassurance or an explanation. Instead, he listened with a grim expression and then quietly warned me, "You know, people talk about that guy. They say he's been seen before, in places you'd least expect." His tone left little room for doubt that this wasn't merely a case of overactive imagination. The details were disturbing: fleeting glimpses at night, cryptic texts, even unexplained questions from strangers that dug too deep into personal history. It was as if the man was gathering information, or perhaps luring us into something we couldn't comprehend. Now, as I write this, I remain unsettled by the thought that the stranger is not confined to that one fateful night or even to the boundaries of my small town. His presence, ever so subtle yet unmistakably real, lurks in the shadows of every unfamiliar street and every quiet corner. I have taken precautions, changing my routes, avoiding poorly lit areas, even considering moving away, but the pervasive fear lingers like a cold mist. What if he is not alone? What if this is only a fragment of a much larger, more insidious network of watchers, silently tracking our lives? The thought that his dark gaze could be anywhere, at any time, casts a long shadow over every ordinary moment. I share this story not for sympathy, but as a warning. The unsettling mark he left on my life isn't isolated. It's part of a pattern, a series of events that defies easy explanation. Every time I glimpse a hooded figure out of the corner of my eye, my heart races with the chilling possibility that he's still out there, lurking, waiting for his next move. And I shudder to think that if my experience isn't unique, then perhaps the world is a far more dangerous place than we dare to admit, where strangers with hidden agendas could be just around the corner, watching, waiting, and forever altering the course of our lives. I first noticed it on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday. I had just moved into a small, second-floor apartment in a quiet building, a place I thought would be my refuge after a long, draining year. At first, everything seemed perfectly normal. The faded wallpaper, the creaky wooden floors, even the quiet hum of the heating system on cold mornings. But one evening, as I settled into my favorite armchair with a book, I realized that the small porcelain figurine I'd placed on the coffee table a week earlier was missing. I searched every corner of the living room, then retraced my steps from that day. Nothing out of place, nothing that could explain its disappearance. I told myself I must have moved it and forgotten, though a nagging unease lingered. Over the next several days, other oddities began to surface. On a morning when I was making coffee, I noticed that the spoon I usually used was not in the drawer where I kept it. Later, after a long day at work, I returned home to find the same book I had left open on the side table had been closed and even slightly shifted to the left. The changes were small, almost imperceptible, yet they slowly chipped away at my sense of security. I started to keep a mental log, noting each detail. A cushion that had moved just a few inches, a lamp that flickered in a pattern that wasn't its usual routine. Even the faint, unfamiliar smell of smoke lingering near the hallway door where no appliance had ever malfunctioned before. One night, I woke up to a soft, rhythmic tapping sound coming from somewhere in the apartment. At first, I assumed it was the wind or perhaps the building settling, but the sound persisted, almost as if it were deliberate. I crept out of bed and followed the noise to the kitchen, only to find tiny, dark smudges on the countertop, marks that looked like the remnants of ash or soot. I had no fireplace in my apartment, and none of my neighbors had ever mentioned any strange occurrences. I wiped the marks away, convincing myself it must have been a trick of the dim light, but the unease in my chest deepened. I began to wonder if I was losing my grip on reality. I mentioned the disappearing figurine and the shifted book to a friend, expecting reassurance, but she simply smiled and said, "Maybe you're just stressed. Sometimes our minds play tricks on us." Even the building's superintendent shrugged off my concerns as typical wear and tear. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that these weren't random coincidences, but deliberate alterations I couldn't explain. Then, things escalated further. One afternoon, I returned from work to find a handwritten note pinned to my door with a pushpin. It read simply, "I see you," in neat, cursive letters. My heart pounded as I scanned the hallway for any sign of another presence, but I found nothing, only the usual quiet murmur of the building. That night, while lying in bed, I saw a shadow flit across the living room wall. I bolted upright, straining my eyes in the dark, but it was gone. I forced myself to sleep, yet the image haunted my dreams. As the weeks went by, the disturbances became even more perplexing. Objects in my apartment would inexplicably move from one place to another. I'd leave my keys on the entry table, only to find them on the kitchen counter later. A painting I'd hung in the hallway one day was gone the next, replaced by a similar but distinctly different image, a landscape that looked both familiar and alien. I began to suspect that time itself was slipping around me. There were moments when I felt disoriented, as if I'd spent an hour doing something, only to realize it had been mere minutes. The boundaries between my actions and their aftermath started to blur. I set up a small camera to capture any anomalies while I slept, hoping for evidence that could explain what was happening. When I reviewed the footage, I saw nothing overtly supernatural, just the quiet dark of my empty apartment. But in one clip around 3:15 a.m., I noticed the bookshelf in my living room shift imperceptibly. At first, it was so slight I questioned whether it was a flaw in the camera's recording. But over several nights, the same subtle movement occurred, as if someone or something was rearranging my belongings with deliberate care. Every explanation I tried to muster fell short. Was it my imagination? Had I somehow forgotten moments when I moved these items myself? The more I analyzed the events, the more I felt that my environment was being tampered with by an unseen force. My interactions with neighbors became strained. When I mentioned these occurrences, they exchanged puzzled glances or politely changed the subject, as if they were unaware of the shifts in our shared spaces. I began to wonder if I was alone in perceiving these changes, or if something larger was at play, a system or presence that manipulated reality in small, unsettling ways. One stormy night, as rain pounded the windows, I sat alone in my living room. The lights flickered, casting long, shifting shadows across the walls. I heard the distant hum of the refrigerator, and then a whisper, a soft, almost inaudible voice that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "They are coming," it said, so faintly that I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. I sat frozen, heart in my throat, questioning whether the voice was a product of my tired mind or a prelude to something far more ominous. Now, I still live in that apartment, though I rarely spend nights there. The changes continue, growing ever more subtle and pervasive, as if the place is alive and rearranging itself at will. Every time I return, I brace myself for the inexplicable. I'm left with the lingering dread that what I've been experiencing is not just a series of random coincidences, but part of a larger, unexplainable picture, a phenomenon that defies logical explanation. Sometimes I wonder if I'm the only one who sees the cracks in our reality, if I'm trapped in a loop of disturbances that no one else acknowledges. And as I continue to question my own memories and perceptions, I can't help but ask, was it all in my head, or is there something far more sinister orchestrating these changes? The mystery remains unsolved, leaving me with a persistent sense of unease every time I step into that space. A space that seems to whisper, in its own silent way, that the true horror may lie in what we choose not to see. I moved into a modest apartment on the third floor of an old brick building in mid-October, eager for a fresh start after a tumultuous year. The place was unremarkable at first glance. Faded wallpaper, creaky hardwood floors, and a narrow hallway lined with the portraits of long-departed residents. My neighbors seemed polite, if distant, and life settled into a routine that felt safe and predictable. But within weeks, I began to notice small things that didn't quite add up. It started with my living room. I distinctly remembered leaving my favorite framed photograph on the coffee table facing the window. One evening, after a long day at work, I returned to find it turned sideways, its image inverted. I assumed I must have knocked it over in a moment of distraction, but when I straightened it, nothing else seemed disturbed. The next morning, however, the photograph was back to its original position, as if it had been reset overnight. At first, I shrugged it off as my own absent-mindedness, but the unsettling feeling lingered. Around the same time, I met my new neighbor, Mrs. Ellison, who lived directly across the hall. At first, she was warm and chatty, sharing stories of her youth and the history of the building. Yet during subsequent encounters, her recollections began to shift. One day, she recalled details about the building's construction that contradicted everything I'd read in the old leasing pamphlet. Another time, she mentioned a grand ball held in the lobby that I knew had never taken place. When I questioned her later, she only offered a vague smile and changed the subject, as if embarrassed by her own words. Then there were the messages. A week after moving in, I found a sticky note attached to my front door. It read, "Look closer." I assumed it was a prank from a neighbor or a mischievous teenager in the building. But as days passed, more notes appeared in unexpected places. A folded paper slipped under my door, a message taped to the back of my mail slot. The words were always cryptic. "Not all is as it seems. Time isn't yours, and they watch." I showed one to a friend over the phone, but when I described the handwriting and style, she insisted she'd never seen anything like it, and the building's management claimed no reports of vandalism had been made. At work, the oddities continued. During lunch breaks, I began noticing that colleagues repeated conversations word for word, as if stuck on loop. A coworker who once joked about weekend plans now discussed them with eerie precision, recounting details I was sure hadn't been mentioned. When I brought it up, they laughed it off, but the sameness of their expressions and the monotony in their voices made my skin crawl. I started to feel as if my entire environment was subtly rearranging itself, and I was the only one who sensed it. One rainy evening, as I sat alone in my dimly lit living room, I experienced the strangest phenomenon yet. I distinctly remembered leaving the television off when I went to bed, but as I passed by later, I caught a faint blue glow emanating from the screen. Approaching it cautiously, I discovered that a single channel had been left playing, an old black and white film I had never seen before. The scene on the screen depicted a lavish ballroom, filled with elegantly dressed figures moving in slow, hypnotic circles. I turned the TV off, convinced it was a technical glitch, yet when I returned the next day, the film was playing again. I could have sworn I hadn't left it on. My anxiety mounted as I started to notice gaps in my own memory. There were mornings when I'd wake up feeling as if hours had slipped away and days when I struggled to recall simple details of what had happened. I even found a notebook on my desk with entries written in my handwriting describing events I couldn't possibly have experienced. The more I tried to piece things together logically, the more isolated and unnerved I became. Every attempt to share my experiences with friends or neighbors was met with polite dismissals or puzzled smiles, as if I were imagining everything. Late one night, after another unsettling day, I sat on my couch in near total darkness. The only light came from the flickering street lamp outside my window, casting shifting shadows across the room. In that oppressive silence, I heard the faint sound of someone whispering my name from somewhere deep within the apartment. I bolted upright, heart pounding, but found nothing, only the relentless drip of rain on the window pane. That moment crystallized my fear. I was no longer sure if the disturbances were confined to my surroundings or if they were somehow a part of me, altering my very perception of reality. Now, as I write this, I'm haunted by the realization that my world has become something unrecognizable, a place where familiar objects, once steady and reliable, move and change when I'm not looking, where even the people I know seem to harbor secrets of a reality I can't grasp. I've spent countless nights scanning the darkness for any sign of the inexplicable, desperately trying to convince myself that it's all just coincidence. But deep down, I sense that something far more sinister is at play, an undercurrent of manipulation that no one else seems to perceive. I'm trapped in a loop of subtle alterations and unexplainable messages, isolated in my knowledge that the reality around me is not as it appears. I fear that the world I once knew has been irrevocably altered, and I may be the only one left to witness its slow, disturbing unraveling. I first met him on a brisk autumn afternoon at a local art gallery where I'd gone to escape the monotony of everyday life. He was standing by a painting, a somber landscape of a windswept moor, studying it intently. When our eyes met, he offered a warm smile and introduced himself as Evan. His manner was unassuming and his conversation easy, as he remarked on the delicate brushstrokes and muted colors. At first, I chalked it up to the simple pleasure of meeting a kindred spirit in a shared moment of art appreciation. Yet even then, something about the precision of his observations struck me as a little too calculated, as if he had memorized every detail of that very painting, down to the exact time I had lingered before it. Over the next few weeks, our paths crossed repeatedly in unexpected ways. One morning, I bumped into Evan at a quaint coffee shop tucked away on a quiet side street. He greeted me by name and inquired about my weekend plans, mentioning details I'd casually shared with a friend only days before. His knowledge of these seemingly private snippets of my life was unsettling, though I tried to convince myself it was merely coincidence. Still, a persistent, nagging doubt began to grow in the back of my mind. As autumn deepened into winter, his appearances became less sporadic and more deliberate. I noticed him in the park on crisp mornings when I was jogging, always a few steps behind yet never too close. At times, I would catch him out of the corner of my eye as I left work, his silhouette lingering in the distance. One evening, while I was waiting for the bus on a rain-soaked street, I saw him standing under a flickering street lamp. He seemed to be watching me intently, his eyes reflecting the dim light, and when our gazes locked, I felt an inexplicable chill. His expression was friendly enough, but the intensity in his look suggested that he knew more about me than a casual acquaintance should. The situation escalated subtly. I began to find small, inexplicable reminders of him in my daily life. A notebook I had left on my desk one evening was inexplicably placed on the kitchen counter the next morning. I received an anonymous text that read, "I remember your favorite song, despite never having mentioned it to anyone." At a mutual friends gathering, Evan casually remarked on a deeply personal detail about a recent breakup I had confided in confidence, as if he had been privy to my private conversation. Each instance, minor on its own, began to accumulate into a pattern that left me feeling exposed and unnerved. One particularly disconcerting encounter occurred on a bitterly cold night. I had been returning from a late shift when I noticed Evan waiting outside my apartment building. His posture was relaxed, almost nonchalant, yet the air of familiarity was impossible to ignore. As I approached the entrance, he greeted me in a soft, measured tone. "I was just in the neighborhood and thought you might appreciate some company." His words were gentle, but they carried an undercurrent of knowing far too much about my routine. I tried to smile and offer a polite goodbye, but the knot of dread in my stomach tightened with every step I took toward my door. In the days that followed, I took every precaution I could think of. I altered my usual routes, avoided my regular haunts, and even changed my phone number. Yet Evan's presence seemed to persist. Sometimes I would see him in a reflection, briefly, in a shop window, or in the glint of a car mirror. Always watching, always waiting. His timing was uncanny. Whenever I felt most vulnerable, after a difficult phone call or a particularly disheartening day at work, he would appear as if summoned by my own despair. I began to wonder if I was merely attracting coincidences, or if I had inadvertently become the subject of someone's obsessive scrutiny. Desperation nudged me to confront the mounting mystery head-on. One chilly evening, I decided to approach him directly in a quiet corner of the city park. With my heart pounding and my voice trembling slightly, I asked, "Evan, why do you seem to know so much about me? How do you always appear when I'm feeling alone?" He laughed softly, his eyes glinting with a mix of amusement and something I couldn't quite decipher. "Perhaps I'm just a keen observer," he replied enigmatically. "Or maybe our paths were meant to cross." His answer, vague and disarming, did nothing to quell my growing anxiety. Instead, it left me feeling more isolated, as if I were trapped in a script I hadn't agreed to play. In the privacy of my apartment, I began to document every encounter in painstaking detail. I recorded times, locations, and the exact words exchanged. I even reviewed security footage from my building, desperate to find an explanation for how this stranger managed to appear in my life with such precision. But each new piece of evidence only deepened the mystery. How could one person know my schedule, my favorite coffee blend, or the specific route I took on my nightly walk? And why did he always seem to manifest when I was most alone, most vulnerable? Now, as I sit in the dim light of my living room, the unanswered questions swirl around me like a dark cloud. I scour online forums and local news for any mention of someone matching his description, yet nothing concrete emerges. Only whispers of similar experiences from others who, like me, have felt the icy grip of being watched. I try to cling to rational explanations. Perhaps it's all a series of bizarre coincidences, or maybe I'm overreacting to a string of benign encounters. But deep down, I know that the pattern is too deliberate, too personal, to be dismissed as mere chance. Every time I step outside, every time I catch a glimpse of a stranger's face in a crowd, I feel the persistent, unsettling sensation that I'm not alone. The possibility that someone is tracking my movements, piecing together my life with meticulous care, has transformed my daily routine into a series of calculated risks. I still don't have a clear answer. Am I simply a magnet for coincidences, or is Evan truly the harbinger of something far more sinister? As I close this chapter of my story, I am left with a lingering, chilling uncertainty. Is it all in my head, or is someone orchestrating every encounter, leaving me perpetually vulnerable under an unblinking gaze? Ever since I moved into the abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of a forgotten town, a creeping dread has shadowed my every step. I was lured by the promise of solitude and a chance to escape the clamor of city life. But the silence of this place is far from comforting. On my first night, I lay awake listening to the persistent drip of rainwater seeping through the old roof. In the quiet hours, a soft murmur echoed through the hallways, as if distant voices were conversing in hushed tones. I initially blamed my imagination and the eerie isolation, yet the sounds grew clearer with each passing night. One evening, while rummaging through the attic for old heirlooms, I discovered a faded journal. Its pages, brittle and yellowed with age, detailed accounts of inexplicable occurrences, doors that opened on their own, shadowy figures glimpsed in peripheral vision, and voices that whispered warnings in the dead of night. The entries ended abruptly, leaving a final, cryptic note about an entity that lurked in the dark corners of the house, watching, waiting for the unwary. As the weeks turned into months, the inexplicable happenings intensified. I would find muddy footprints trailing away from my bedroom door, only to vanish without a trace. Objects moved mysteriously, and on several occasions, I felt an icy presence brush against my skin, as if an unseen force passed by in the night. My sleep was haunted by vivid dreams of a gaunt, spectral figure with hollow eyes that silently observed me from the shadows. I began to question my own sanity, wondering if the isolation was distorting my perception of reality. But then, one fateful night, everything changed. A violent storm raged outside, and the power flickered incessantly, plunging the farmhouse into darkness. In that oppressive blackness, the whispers turned into anguished cries. I could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps pacing in the hallway, growing louder with each heartbeat. Summoning all my courage, I crept out of bed to follow the noise, my trembling hands clutching a dim flashlight. As I stepped into the corridor, the beam of light revealed an impossible sight. A figure, half obscured by shadows, stood at the far end. Its face was a twisted mask of sorrow and malice, and in its eyes, I saw a torment that defied explanation. Frozen in terror, I watched as it slowly advanced, its form wavering like smoke in a gust of wind. I attempted to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. The room seemed to close in on me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of despair and foreboding. In that moment, I realized that the entity was not merely a figment of my imagination, but a tangible force bound to the house by a tragic past. The specter raised a skeletal hand, beckoning me to follow, as if inviting me to share in its eternal anguish. I bolted back to my room, slamming the door behind me, yet the sound of its footsteps continued, echoing through the floorboards long after I had locked myself inside. I spent the remainder of that night huddled under blankets, eyes wide in terror, as the unseen presence circled outside, its whispers now a chorus of despair. In the days that followed, I attempted to document every incident, every unexplainable sound, every fleeting glimpse of that haunting visage. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones of the farmhouse's grim history, a tale of loss, betrayal, and a restless spirit condemned to wander its halls. I eventually left the house, abandoning my attempts to uncover its secrets, but the memories remain etched in my mind. Even now, as I write this, I can still hear the faint echoes of that anguished cry, a reminder that some places are cursed by a past too dark to ever fade. And sometimes, in the silence of the night, when the world is asleep, I wonder if the entity still watches, waiting for another soul to cross its path, forever bound to the shadows of that forsaken farmhouse. As the years passed, I tried to forget, to escape the torment of those memories, but the past has a way of resurfacing. I began receiving inexplicable letters, written in a spidery hand on brittle paper, warning me of the dire consequences of uncovering too much. The messages spoke of a sorrowful fate and hinted at a lineage of tragedy that linked me to the very spirit I had encountered. Plagued by paranoia, I found my reflection occasionally betraying a glimpse of that hollow-eyed figure, its mournful gaze following me even in broad daylight. Sleep became a rare visitor as nightmares blurred with waking hours, each moment steeped in a dread that I could neither explain nor shake off. Compelled by a mix of fear and desperate need for closure, I returned to the farmhouse one cold evening, determined to confront the enigma head-on. In the dust-choked attic, amid relics of a bygone era, I uncovered a faded photograph of a smiling family whose eyes, however, held an unspoken melancholy. Newspaper clippings recounted mysterious disappearances and hinted at an inexplicable curse, each article more cryptic than the last. The truth emerged like a broken mirror, fragmented and haunting. The spirit, once human, had been consumed by grief and betrayal, her torment echoing through the ages. Wandering through the silent corridors, I was drawn to a room bathed in an otherworldly glow, where a grand piano played itself in a sorrowful melody. The notes, both beautiful and forlorn, seemed to reach into the depths of my soul, urging me to understand the tragedy that bound us together. In that moment, as the melody faded, I realized the horror was not of malicious intent, but of a ceaseless, unending sorrow. Yet, even with this revelation, the unanswered questions linger. I left the farmhouse with more doubts than certainties, forever haunted by the possibility that the darkness I encountered was merely the surface of an ancient, unyielding curse. The silence now carries a weight of its own, a reminder that some mysteries defy resolution, leaving a chilling uncertainty that no amount of time can ever erase. Even now, I remain haunted by the echo of those lost voices and the relentless, cold touch of despair that still lingers in my dreams. I often wonder if, somewhere in the endless night, the farmhouse awaits its next visitor, ready to weave their fate into its tapestry of sorrow. The experience has left me forever changed, a prisoner to a memory that refuses to fade, and a soul that can never escape the grasp of the darkness. The unknown persists, an eternal specter that defies explanation, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and a heart forever trembling in the shadow of fear. No matter how far I run, the memory of that night and the echo of the farmhouse's despair follow me. In quiet moments, I sense a presence behind every shadow and hear whispers in the stillness of the early dawn. I cannot tell if it is merely my mind playing tricks on me or the restless spirit reaching across time. The truth, like the darkness itself, remains elusive, a riddle wrapped in sorrow, hidden behind layers of silence and fear. And so, I live with this lingering mystery, a constant reminder that some horrors are never truly left behind, that some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. It started on an ordinary Thursday afternoon at the neighborhood cafe, where I usually grab a quick latte before work. I remember sitting at my usual corner table, laptop open, when I glanced up and noticed a man I hadn't seen before, casually reading a newspaper by the window. At first, I dismissed it as a coincidence, a stranger simply enjoying his day. But as I sipped my coffee, I couldn't help but feel his eyes were lingering on me. I told myself it was nothing more than an overactive imagination fueled by too many early mornings and too little sleep. The next day, while I was out running errands at the local grocery store, I caught sight of him again. This time he was in the frozen foods aisle, standing a few feet away, watching me with a slight, almost imperceptible smile. I hesitated for a moment, heart fluttering in a way I couldn't quite explain, but when our eyes met, he simply nodded politely and continued browsing. I tried to convince myself it was a harmless coincidence, the same man frequenting the same neighborhood. Yet something about his presence made me feel unsettled, as if I was being subtly scrutinized. Over the following week, his appearances grew more frequent. I began noticing him in places where I least expected him. One evening, while walking through the park on my way home, I saw him seated on a bench beneath the streetlights, his gaze fixed in my direction as if waiting. At another point, he was at a bus stop, leaning casually against a lamppost, watching me board a bus. Each encounter was fleeting, and every time I tried to piece together his pattern, he was already gone, vanished into the crowd or hidden by the night. It was as if he was always there, just at the edge of my vision, quietly tracking my movements. My initial curiosity slowly transformed into a gnawing anxiety. The first time he struck up a conversation, I was taken aback. I had just stepped out of a bookstore when he approached me, casually remarking, "You look like someone who appreciates a good story." His tone was friendly enough, his smile warm, but the comment felt strangely personal, as if he already knew more about me than a random passerby should. I stammered a thank you and quickly excused myself, feeling a sudden urge to get away. That day, every time I glanced over my shoulder, I half expected to see him following. Then came the small, inexplicable signs that deepened my unease. On several occasions, I'd return home to find little objects out of place. A paperback I distinctly remembered leaving on my bedside table would be found on the kitchen counter instead, or a pen I'd set down in the office later appeared on my front porch. I brushed these off at first as forgetfulness, until I started receiving a series of odd, unsolicited texts from an unknown number. They were brief, often just a single sentence like, "I see you," or "You're always in my thoughts," sent at times when I was alone in the dark. The messages were anonymous, yet disturbingly specific, as if tracking my daily routines. The cumulative effect of these encounters began to erode my sense of safety. I found myself altering my routine, taking different routes home, avoiding my regular cafe, even switching up the time I went for my evening jog. Yet, no matter how much I tried to shake the feeling, he seemed to appear in new, unpredictable ways. I began to notice him in reflective surfaces, a window, a car mirror, even the glossy finish of a smartphone screen. Each time, his presence sent a chill down my spine, leaving me questioning whether my mind was conjuring phantoms or if someone was deliberately orchestrating these encounters. Emotionally, I felt increasingly isolated and helpless. The world around me, once so familiar and comforting, had turned into a stage where I was the unwitting protagonist in someone else's twisted narrative. I tried to confide in friends, but their reassurances fell flat. They dismissed my worries as paranoia, the product of too many sleepless nights. Even the local police, when I mentioned the texts and the repeated sightings, shrugged off my concerns as coincidences. Nothing more than a misunderstanding amplified by my own anxieties. One night, after a particularly harrowing day, I returned home and found a small photograph slipped under my door. It was a candid shot of me taken from outside my window, the timestamp clearly showing it had been snapped just minutes before I arrived. My hands shook as I stared at the image, a mix of fear and disbelief choking me. I didn't know who could have taken it, or how, but the thought that someone was not only watching me, but also intruding into the sanctity of my home was paralyzing. That moment marked the point of no return. I realized that this was no longer a series of bizarre coincidences, but something far more sinister. In the days that followed, every encounter with him left me more unnerved than the last. I began to feel that my entire life was being orchestrated, each step meticulously planned by someone whose intentions I could neither fathom nor escape. My sense of reality blurred. Every friendly nod, every seemingly random encounter, now felt loaded with hidden meaning. I started questioning my own sanity, wondering if I was reading into ordinary events too much. But the evidence was hard to ignore. The man's appearances were too consistent, too perfectly timed, to be mere chance. Now, as I sit in the dim light of my living room, I can't help but wonder if I'm trapped in the middle of an obsessive plan that I never agreed to. The stranger's presence has become a haunting reminder that somewhere, out there, someone might be watching me, studying my habits, mapping my routines, and perhaps even plotting my next move. Every time I leave the house, every time I catch a glimpse of a familiar figure in a crowd, I feel that same familiar prickle of dread. Is it all just an elaborate coincidence born out of my overactive imagination? Or is someone truly stalking me? The uncertainty gnaws at me relentlessly, leaving me to wonder if, no matter how much I try to escape, I'll always be under that silent, unyielding gaze. I first noticed something off when I lost my favorite wristwatch, a gift from my late father that I wore every day without fail. I distinctly remembered placing it on my bedside table the night before. Yet when I awoke that morning, it was gone. I retraced my steps through the apartment, convinced it was simply misplaced. But even as I searched every drawer and nook, the watch remained missing. I mentioned it to my roommate, only to be met with a blank, almost puzzled look as if the watch had never existed. At the time, I chalked it up to exhaustion and a lapse in my memory, but that was only the beginning. In the following days, other small inconsistencies began to creep into my routine. While making coffee one morning, I swore I saw the mug I'd just washed sitting on the counter, only to find it later in the cupboard, completely dry and in a different position. On my walk to work, I encountered a stranger who greeted me warmly by name, though I was certain we'd never met. When I attempted to ask him about it, he simply smiled and walked away, leaving me with an unsettling feeling of being in a dream. I began to suspect that these were mere coincidences, the products of a tired mind, but an undercurrent of disquiet nagged at me. The oddities escalated quickly. One evening, as I returned home from a late shift, I saw a familiar face in the window of the apartment across the street, a neighbor I'd exchanged pleasantries with only weeks before. However, when I later mentioned the encounter at our building's common area, the neighbor insisted he had been out of town for months. His confused expression was mirrored by others who recalled no such encounter, as if the moment had been expunged from their shared memory. I began to feel increasingly alien in my own life, as though I were the only one witnessing a narrative that everyone else had somehow agreed to forget. Then came the day when my sense of isolation hit a fever pitch. I was sitting in a coffee shop, trying to focus on my laptop work, when I overheard a conversation between two strangers discussing a debate we'd had the previous night. A debate I had no recollection of ever having. Their words, though mundane in content, carried a surreal familiarity that gnawed at me. I approached one of them, tentatively asking, "Did we talk last night?" The man stared at me blankly before replying, "I'm sorry, I don't know what you mean," as if I were speaking another language. I left the shop with a sinking feeling that reality was shifting around me, subtly, yet irrevocably. Each day, more anomalies accumulated like stray puzzle pieces that refused to fit. Photographs on my walls seemed to alter their expressions when I wasn't looking, and familiar routes on my daily commute led to dead ends and unexpected detours. I started keeping a detailed journal, documenting every incident in the hope that I could trace a pattern, a logical explanation that might salvage my fraying sanity. But the more I wrote, the more inconsistent the timeline of my life appeared. Friends would recount events with startling differences from my own recollections, and I found myself questioning whether these discrepancies were the product of my own muddled memories or something far more insidious. One night, unable to sleep, I wandered the halls of my apartment building. The corridors, usually so familiar, felt elongated and distorted, as if viewed through a warped lens. I overheard soft murmurs that I couldn't quite decipher and caught fleeting glimpses of shadows that darted just out of the corner of my eye. At one point, I reached a door I was certain led to the laundry room, only to find an empty wall where the door should have been. My heart pounded as I frantically retraced my steps, each turn only deepening the sense that I was caught in a loop, a script that was rewriting itself in real time. I confided in my roommate, desperate for some reassurance, but he too began to exhibit odd behavior. When I mentioned the missing watch and the shifting memories, he shrugged dismissively and said, "I don't remember that happening at all." His words, delivered in a tone devoid of recognition, sent chills down my spine. Was it possible that he was no longer the person I thought I knew? Or had I simply begun to lose touch with reality? Now, I find myself adrift, watching the world around me morph into something unrecognizable. Every day brings a new, subtle alteration, a familiar face that changes expression, a conversation that seems to rewrite itself, a memory that vanishes as quickly as it arrives. I'm left standing on the sidelines of my own life, questioning whether I'm the only one aware of these distortions, or if some unseen force is deliberately reshaping our shared reality. My journal lies open on my desk, filled with detailed entries that no one else seems to remember. I wonder if, in the end, I'm witnessing a deliberate manipulation of time and memory, or if my mind is slowly unraveling under the weight of too many unanswered questions. I write this account not as a confession, but as a plea for understanding, a record of events that defy explanation. As I type these final words, I can't shake the feeling that reality is slipping away, one fragment at a time. Am I truly experiencing these bizarre shifts? Or am I merely the bystander in a story that has been edited beyond my control? I have no answers. Only the lingering dread of a life where nothing is as it seems, and every moment could be a subtle rewriting of the past. I moved into the Maplewood Apartments on a brisk October day, thinking that a fresh start in a quiet, older building would help me move on from a difficult past. At first, everything felt normal. The faded wallpaper, the creaky hardwood floors, even the gentle hum of the aging radiator. But soon I began noticing small, inexplicable changes that left me unsettled. It started with little things. The porcelain figurine I always placed on the coffee table was missing one evening, only to reappear the next morning on the mantel where it had never belonged. Then, I found that a cushion on the sofa had been moved just a few inches from its usual spot, as if an unseen hand had adjusted it during the night. At work, the oddities continued. I would chat with colleagues about our weekend plans, only to have details change subtly in later conversations. My friend Mark, usually warm and affable, began to respond with curt, confused answers about events we both remembered vividly. When I mentioned that I had seen a peculiar note on my apartment door reading, "Everything is shifting," he insisted he had never seen any such thing. I even noticed that the layout of my favorite coffee shop seemed altered. The table I always sat at was now moved closer to the window, and the barista's smile, once genuine, now appeared forced, as if he were reciting a memorized line. The disturbances escalated at home. One night, I returned from work to find a handwritten note pinned to my front door with a small safety pin. In neat, deliberate script it read, "You are not alone." My heart pounded as I scanned the dimly lit corridor, but no one was there. I asked the building manager about it, yet he waved it off as a prank by a mischievous tenant. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play. Doors I distinctly remembered locking were found ajar. Objects I had placed carefully were inexplicably rearranged. A lamp I had left off was on, casting an eerie glow in the hallway, and the clock on the wall seemed to tick in a rhythm that did not match real time. As the days passed, my anxiety grew. I began to document every anomaly in a journal. Notes about the shifted furniture, altered conversations, and even the strange, fleeting encounters with people who acted as if they had forgotten who I was. I started to see the same unfamiliar faces in the building's hallway. A woman in a red coat who always appeared just as I passed a particular doorway. A man with a stern expression lingering near the stairs. When I mentioned these sightings to other residents, they either looked at me with blank confusion or dismissed my concerns outright, insisting that nothing had changed. One particularly unnerving evening, I returned home during a rainstorm to find my apartment bathed in a cold, uncharacteristic light. I stepped inside, and for a split second, it felt as if time had stopped. The air was thick with silence, and every object appeared frozen in an impossible stillness. Then, as suddenly as it began, the moment passed. I blinked, and everything appeared normal. Yet I knew in my bones that something was profoundly wrong. The familiarity of my surroundings had been replaced by a creeping sense of alienation, as though I were living in a version of reality that only I could sense was off. I attempted to reach out to friends and neighbors, to share my mounting dread, but they all insisted that nothing had changed. They laughed off my accounts as mere stress-induced hallucinations. I even visited my old apartment, hoping that seeing the unchanged walls and familiar corridors might reassure me. But there too I found small discrepancies, a misaligned picture frame, a door that creaked differently. It was as if the very fabric of reality had been subtly rewritten, leaving me isolated in my awareness. Now, every night I lie awake listening to the silence of my room, my mind racing with the possibility that I am trapped in an alternate reality. Every morning, I face a world that appears unchanged to everyone else, but is filled with shifting details and inexplicable messages to me alone. I fear that I may never reclaim the certainty of the life I once knew. Whether these changes are a product of my own fragile perception or evidence of something far more sinister, I am left with a lingering terror. The world around me has become a hostile, alien place, where every familiar face and object carries the weight of a hidden, unfathomable truth. I am alone in my knowledge of the glitch in reality, and I can only wonder if, someday, this anomaly will reveal its full, terrifying design, or if I am destined to remain the sole witness to a truth that no one else will ever acknowledge. I moved into my new apartment on a crisp autumn day, eager for a fresh start and a quiet place to call home. At first, everything seemed perfectly ordinary. The building was well kept, my neighbors polite, and my small unit felt like a sanctuary of routine. The first oddity appeared subtly. One evening, after a long day at work, I returned to find my favorite mug exactly where I'd left it on the coffee table. I paused for a moment, a vague sense of familiarity stirring in me, then shrugged it off as the comfort of routine. But that very same mug reappeared in the same spot later that night, even though I distinctly remembered moving it during the day. I told myself I must have forgotten the repositioning, nothing more than a lapse in attention. The next morning, while preparing breakfast, I noticed that the bookshelf in the living room had shifted. A novel I had placed between two memoirs was now nestled between two art books, a subtle rearrangement that I was certain I hadn't made. I glanced around, half expecting to see a friend or neighbor laughing at a prank, but the apartment was silent and undisturbed. Over the following days, these changes grew more frequent. One day, I returned from work to find the couch rotated slightly, its angle different than the one I remembered from yesterday. A decorative vase that had always sat on the side table was inexplicably on the windowsill instead. I started keeping a journal, noting every small alteration. Yet when I reviewed my entries, the changes seemed too deliberate, as if the apartment was reordering itself in a quiet, systematic way. At first, I wondered if I was simply overworked or stressed, that fatigue was warping my perception. I mentioned it to a neighbor, Mrs. Owens, who had lived in the building for years, but she dismissed it with a smile. "You must be imagining things," she said kindly. "Nothing's changed here for as long as I can remember." Her assurance did little to ease the growing dread in my gut. Late one night, I found a folded note on my kitchen counter. Written in neat, precise handwriting, it simply said, "Remember, nothing is as it seems." I felt my pulse quicken. Had someone been in my apartment? I searched every corner for evidence of intrusion. Open windows, displaced items, but found nothing that could explain the message. The changes began seeping into every aspect of my daily life. At work, I had a desk in an otherwise unremarkable office, but I started noticing that personal items I'd left there, a framed photo, a favorite pen, were sometimes in a different position when I returned from lunch. Conversations with colleagues felt eerily disjointed, as if details of our discussions had been subtly edited when I wasn't paying attention. I even began to notice the same unfamiliar car parked in the lot at precisely the same times each day, a car I swore I hadn't seen before. Yet it reappeared without fail. One evening, desperate for answers, I set up my phone on a timer to record the state of my apartment as soon as I entered. When I reviewed the footage, I saw nothing overtly supernatural. But then, near the end of the recording, the camera panned to the hallway for just a split second, and in that moment I caught a glimpse of something impossible. The hallway, which I knew well, appeared to have a new door I had never seen before, its frame slightly ajar as if inviting me to step through. I rewound the video repeatedly, certain it was a hallucination, but the evidence was there, undeniable and chilling. As the weeks dragged on, the changes became more pronounced. I began to wake up in the middle of the night with a deep sense of dislocation, as though the apartment around me had been rearranged while I slept. I would open my eyes to find the layout different. A lamp in a new corner, a chair where there should have been a table, and the air seemed charged with a static energy that prickled my skin. My journal filled with entries documenting every small shift, every unexpected message left on a sticky note, every piece of furniture that moved on its own. I started to fear that I wasn't alone, that some unseen force was deliberately altering my surroundings. Eventually, the realization hit me with a suffocating certainty. I wasn't merely experiencing random coincidences or the effects of stress. I had stumbled into something far more disturbing, a closed loop or alternate reality where my environment was in a state of perpetual, imperceptible flux. The comforting stability of my new home had become a trap, a maze of ever-changing details designed to confound and unsettle. I began to wonder if the apartment, and perhaps the world itself, was nothing more than an elaborate construct, a simulation that was being rewritten minute by minute. Now, as I sit here in the dim light of a late night, I can no longer trust the solidity of what surrounds me. Every time I return, I brace myself for the subtle, yet relentless, alterations that await me. I feel as if I have become part of an anomaly, a glitch in a programmed reality that I can neither control nor escape. The note, the rearranged furniture, the shifting time, they all point to one terrifying truth. The reality I once knew is slipping away, replaced by a world where nothing is fixed and everything may be manipulated by forces beyond my comprehension. I'm left with the haunting question of whether it even matters. For if reality is just an illusion in constant flux, what is there left to hold on to? It started with the doormat. I'd lived in the same apartment for 3 years, and the hallway always looked the same. Worn beige carpet, dim yellow lighting, and my cheap gray doormat with a faded welcome barely visible from years of wear. But one evening, as I came home from work, I stopped in my tracks. The doormat was different. It wasn't a huge change, but it was enough to make my stomach twist. Instead of the old gray mat, there was a new, pristine black one, with an ornate gold design along the edges. I frowned. Maybe maintenance had replaced it? Maybe a neighbor had switched mats by accident? I pushed open my door and stepped inside, but the uneasy feeling clung to me for the rest of the night. The next morning, I left for work, glancing down at the mat as I stepped over it. It was gray again. I stared for a long time, my breath catching in my throat. Maybe I was just tired the night before. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. That was a logical explanation, right? But as I walked down the hall, something else gnawed at me. A feeling, subtle but growing, that something in the building had shifted. Over the next few days, it kept happening. Tiny, almost imperceptible changes. The door to my neighbor's apartment had always had a small scratch near the handle. One morning, it was gone. The framed picture in the lobby, previously an old black and white image of the city, suddenly depicted an entirely different scene, a landscape with mountains I didn't recognize. I asked the front desk about it, but the woman just gave me a confused look. "It's always been that way," she said, sounding almost irritated. At work, it was the same. The coffee machine in the break room, which had always been a clunky old thing, was now sleek and new. My co-worker, Greg, who had a thick beard since the day I met him, came in clean-shaven without a trace of stubble. "Finally decided to shave, huh?" I joked. He just frowned at me. "What do you mean? I've never had a beard." I forced a laugh, but my blood ran cold. Maybe he was messing with me. Maybe I was remembering wrong. But the unease was growing, creeping into my bones. Then, one night, I woke up at 3 a.m. with a suffocating sense of wrongness. The air in my room felt heavier, thicker somehow, like the walls had closed in by a fraction of an inch. I turned on my bedside lamp, blinking in the soft glow, and my stomach dropped. My bedroom door was on the wrong side of the room. I scrambled out of bed, heart pounding. It had always been on the left. I was sure of it, but now it was on the right, as if my entire apartment had subtly rearranged itself while I slept. My breath came fast and shallow. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. It looked the same beige carpet, same dim lights. But it felt different, like I had stepped into a copy of my building, a near-perfect replica that was just slightly off. I knocked on my neighbor's door, desperate for some kind of confirmation that I wasn't losing my mind. An unfamiliar woman answered. I stumbled back. Sorry. I thought this was Mrs. Patel's apartment." She tilted her head. "Who?" "Mrs. Patel. She's lived here for years." The woman gave me a tight smile, the kind you give to someone who's making you uncomfortable. "I've been living here for the past 5 years. I don't know any Mrs. Patel." I didn't respond. I just backed away and practically ran back to my apartment, slamming the door behind me. I sat on my couch, gripping the armrests so hard my knuckles ached. None of this made sense. I checked my phone, flipping through old text messages. There, a text from Mrs. Patel from just last week, asking if I could water her plants while she visited her daughter. But when I scrolled up to our previous conversations, the texts were gone, like they had never existed. My head was spinning. I needed proof, something tangible. I grabbed my laptop and started searching the apartment complex online, looking for old listings, reviews, anything that might confirm the way things used to be. But as I scrolled through page after page, my stomach clenched. The name of the building had changed. It was a small change, one word different. I might not have even noticed if I weren't desperately looking for something familiar. But I knew it hadn't always been this. I checked an old email from my landlord, and sure enough, even in the subject line, the name was different. I slammed my laptop shut. Was this a glitch in my memory? A gas leak making me hallucinate? I tried to tell myself there was a rational explanation, but deep down, I knew there wasn't. Because with each passing day, more things changed. The grocery store down the street had a new sign, but no one seemed to notice. The receptionist at my gym, who I'd talked to for months, suddenly acted like she had never met me. And Greg, my coworker, he didn't just not have a beard anymore. Now he didn't exist at all. "Who's Greg?" my manager asked when I brought him up. I could barely breathe. I had eaten lunch with Greg 3 days ago. We had talked about his upcoming trip to Colorado. I checked my phone, but there were no texts from him. No emails. No photos. It was like he had been erased. I don't know what's happening to me. Every morning, I wake up terrified that something else will have shifted. I keep taking photos of my apartment, my neighborhood, my office, try to hold on to proof, but the photos never show anything different. I try to talk to people about it, but they just look at me like I'm crazy. The worst part? I'm starting to forget. I can feel it, slipping like sand through my fingers. I can't remember my landlord's name. I can't remember the last time I called my sister. When I try to picture my old apartment layout, it's fuzzy, like a dream I can't quite grasp. I'm afraid that soon, I won't remember what was real in the first place. And then I'll belong to whatever this is. It began on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I woke to the familiar sound of my alarm at 6:30 a.m., stretched, and went about my routine, coffee, a quick shower, and the same walk to the bus stop. But as I sipped my coffee, I noticed something odd. For a brief second, the reflection in the window behind me shimmered strangely, as if the glass had a ripple. I dismissed it as a trick of sleep, nothing more. At work, the day unfolded as usual. Emails, meetings, and idle chit-chat with coworkers. Yet in passing, I overheard 2 colleagues mention a lunch meeting that I distinctly remembered never happening. One of them even insisted that I had been there, laughing and chatting as if it were the most normal occurrence. I felt a flicker of confusion, but chalked it up to a miscommunication. Over the following days, subtle glitches began to puncture the seams of normality. On my commute home, I repeatedly caught sight of a man in a dark jacket who, I was sure, I hadn't noticed before. Yet every time I looked away and then back, he was there, standing under a street lamp at the same spot, his face unchanging, as if he were a fixed element in a scene I had already seen. At home, the oddities grew bolder. I entered my living room one evening, fully expecting to see my favorite armchair exactly where I left it, only to find it moved by a few inches, its position slightly rotated. A few minutes later, I returned to the room after making a phone call, and everything was back to normal, as if nothing had ever shifted. Initially, these incidents were small enough to be dismissed as mere coincidences or misremembered details. I told myself that my mind was simply overreacting, that I must have forgotten or mislaid things in the rush of daily life. But soon, the inconsistencies began to compound. I started noticing that conversations with friends seemed to replay with subtle differences. A joke I had shared yesterday was met with confused laughter today, as though the punchline had inexplicably changed. Even my computer desktop, which I had painstakingly organized the night before, would rearrange itself overnight into a configuration that was eerily familiar, yet unmistakably different. Then came the moment that shattered any lingering hope of a rational explanation. One evening, I arrived home to find my apartment door slightly ajar, though I was sure I had locked it. Stepping inside, I saw that the furniture was not as I had left it. The bookshelf had been shifted, and a framed photograph that always hung above the mantel was now on the side table. I searched for any sign of intrusion, but nothing was amiss. No fingerprints, no signs of a break-in. The environment, my once stable sanctuary, had inexplicably altered itself, as if the fabric of reality had been rewritten while I slept. At first, I was disturbed, but then an odd calm began to settle over me. The glitches started to blend into my daily existence, becoming as ordinary as the sunrise. I began to expect them. The slight misplacement of objects, the repeated appearance of the same stranger on my commute, the conversations that looped back on themselves with minute alterations. It was as though I had slipped into a version of reality that was slightly out of sync, like a recording with a few frames missing or rearranged. I even began to notice that the same scenes repeated with variations. I'd sit at a cafe, watch a barista serve me a latte, and then later, I'd see that exact moment replay on a busy street corner, as if time were looping in short, inexplicable bursts. The more I acclimated to these disturbances, the more I started to wonder if I was the only one who could perceive them. I asked friends if they noticed the changes, but they all insisted nothing had shifted. They remembered the world as it always was, the same office layout, the same conversation details, the same unchanged surroundings. It was as if I alone was privy to this secret malfunction, this subtle reordering of reality. The line between what was real and what was not began to blur, and I found myself questioning whether I was truly awake or merely a passenger in a glitching simulation. One particularly surreal evening, I sat alone in my dimly lit apartment, watching as the familiar hum of the city outside morphed into a soft, intermittent buzz. I glanced at the clock on the wall, its hands moving steadily at first, then jerking back for a split second before resuming their course. In that moment, I realized with a cold certainty that time itself might be one of the variables in this inexplicable glitch. I looked around my room. Every item, every shadow, seemed to shimmer with an imperceptible distortion. The sensation was not one of panic, but of profound dislocation. As if I were watching a film that had suddenly begun to loop, its scenes rearranged in ways that defied logic. As the days merged together in this continuous cycle of repeated, yet altered moments, I began to accept that normalcy was a concept that no longer applied to my life. I would walk down the same street, only to see a storefront with a new sign, or pass by a park where the trees seemed to have swapped places with those on the opposite side. The glitches were everywhere, a quiet undercurrent that turned my once familiar world into something alien and mutable. I no longer tried to fight the inconsistency. I simply observed, cataloged, and gradually surrendered to the notion that this was my new reality. Then one final incident drove the point home. I returned to my apartment after a long day, weary and expecting the usual minor disturbances. As I opened the door, I was struck by an overwhelming sense of déjà vu. The room was arranged exactly as I remembered it from yesterday. Every item in its familiar place, every shadow in the expected spot. But as I stepped further inside, the sound of a digital chime echoed, and the lights flickered in perfect rhythmic pulses. I turned, and in the mirror above the sink, I saw not just my own reflection, but the faint, ghostly outline of another figure standing directly behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was no one there. The mirror, however, continued to display that extra presence, as if it were an overlay on my own image, an undeniable sign that I was not alone in this malfunctioning reality. In that moment, I understood the terrifying truth. I had become part of the glitch. The subtle changes, the repeated scenes, the shifting of objects and time. They were not random coincidences, but deliberate alterations of a world that was slowly unraveling around me. I realized that I might never return to the stable, predictable reality I once knew. Each day now felt like an iteration in a flawed simulation, and I was trapped within its endless loop, a permanent glitch in the system. I sit here now, in a world that is both familiar and foreign, wondering if anyone else sees the cracks or if I am doomed to watch as reality itself continues to break down. The comfort of normalcy has been replaced by a perpetual sense of disquiet, and I fear that my life, along with everything I once trusted, has become nothing more than a series of fragmented, repeating moments, forever altered, forever part of the glitch. I first began noticing the changes on an ordinary Monday morning. I'd woken up, groggy from a night of little sleep, and shuffled into the kitchen for my usual cup of coffee. Everything looked normal at first. Faded yellow curtains, chipped ceramic mug, the same creaky hardwood floor I'd grown accustomed to in my small apartment. But as I reached for the sugar jar, I realized it was not the same jar I remembered. The label had been replaced with an unfamiliar sticker in a handwriting that I couldn't quite place, and the jar itself was a different shape, almost foreign. I chalked it up to a mix-up in the landlord's maintenance routine and told myself that over time, things tend to change in old buildings. That evening, I met my neighbor Lisa in the hallway. We'd exchanged pleasantries for months, always smiling, always nodding as we passed by. But that night, she greeted me with an odd hesitation in her voice, as if she were about to say something else, something she immediately swallowed. "Good night," she said, then hurried away without her usual warm smile. I wondered if I was overthinking it, but a nagging sense of unease took root. Over the next few days, the changes became more insidious. When I returned home from work, I would catch glimpses of my apartment that weren't quite as I remembered them. The position of a bookshelf might be slightly askew, or a cushion on the sofa would be placed in a different spot from the day before. I found a note on my desk one afternoon that simply read, "Remember who you are," written in a hand that wasn't mine. I asked my best friend about it, showing him the note and explaining the strange, shifting details. He frowned, assuring me that I must have misremembered and that nothing had changed. My apartment was exactly as it had always been. But the recollection of that note gnawed at me. At work, the oddities persisted. A colleague, Mark, who I had known for years, began acting out of character. One morning, he complimented me on my new, modern haircut, even though I hadn't changed my style in years. Another day, he recounted an office conversation with details I knew never happened, as if I had shared private thoughts that I was sure I'd never uttered. When I confronted him, he simply laughed it off, saying, "You're just tired, man. Your memory's playing tricks on you." But his eyes held something unreadable, an inscrutable look that made me shiver. Each time I tried to voice my concerns, the reactions were the same. Dismissive nods, half smiles, and a strange insistence that I was imagining things. I started keeping a journal, scribbling down every small detail that felt out of place. The new design of the sugar jar, Lisa's altered greeting, Mark's offhand compliments. I took pictures of my apartment every morning before I left, comparing them later, and although the differences were subtle, they were undeniably there. The wallpaper in my living room, once a comforting pattern of faded blues and greens, now seemed to shift in hue from one glance to the next. The familiar creak of my floorboards, which I'd always considered a benign quirk, had begun to sound like the deliberate footfalls of someone pacing in the dark. One particularly unsettling night, I sat in my living room trying to calm my nerves when I noticed something even more disturbing. The television, which I had left on a static channel as background noise, suddenly switched to a series of images, flickering snapshots of places I recognized from my own apartment, but with small, disturbing variations. A window open when I was sure I'd closed it, a door that shouldn't exist in the hallway, a clock that read a time that made no sense. I reached for the remote, but the images continued unabated, as if the TV had taken on a life of its own. I shut it off, convinced it was a glitch, but the images had already burrowed into my mind. The changes extended beyond objects and people. Even my own memories began to falter. I started experiencing moments of disorientation, like waking up in the middle of the night with vivid recollections of events I knew I hadn't lived through. One morning, I distinctly remembered preparing breakfast, only to find the kitchen completely bare, as if the act had been erased from reality. I questioned my sanity, desperate for someone to validate my experiences, but every time I brought it up, friends and family brushed it off as stress or the effects of too little sleep. The more I searched for answers, the more I felt isolated, as though I were trapped in a parallel version of the world where everything was exactly as it should be for everyone else except for me. I began to notice patterns, small, inexplicable changes that repeated in a loop. A vase would be moved, then later returned to its original spot without my intervention. A message would appear on my desk one day and vanish the next, only to reappear later with subtle alterations. It was as if I were caught in some kind of elaborate system, a glitch in reality that only affected me. One chilly evening, as I was reviewing my journal, I realized that my life was slowly unraveling. The once comforting routine of my days had become a series of disjointed, shifting moments. I felt as if I were living in a world that was gradually being rewritten before my eyes, a world that others saw as completely normal, while I was left to question every detail. I began to wonder if I was the only one experiencing this, if perhaps I had been thrust into an alternate reality that overlapped with my own, where the familiar was constantly in flux. Now, as I sit alone in the dim light of my apartment, I am haunted by the unsettling notion that everything around me is not as it seems. The changes, once small and almost dismissible, have grown into a relentless tide of uncertainty. Every creak of the floor, every shifting object, every altered greeting from a familiar face fills me with a creeping dread that I can no longer shake. I have tried to find rational explanations, faulty memory, stress, even an overactive imagination, but nothing fits the pattern. It's as if reality itself has become mutable, subject to forces beyond my comprehension, and I am the only one who can see the cracks. I fear that I am trapped in a world that looks perfectly normal to everyone else, but to me, it has become a hostile, ever-changing landscape. Every attempt to return to the way things once were is met with subtle shifts and inconsistencies that erase the past and replace it with something unfamiliar. And so, I'm left here questioning not only the solidity of the world around me, but also my own sanity. Whether these disturbances are a figment of my perception or the work of something far more sinister remains a mystery. But one thing is certain. The reality I once trusted is slipping away, replaced by a fragmented, alien existence from which I fear there may be no escape. I moved into my new apartment on a brisk autumn day, excited for a fresh start after years of cramped living. The place was small but cozy, a modest one-bedroom on the third floor of an aging brick building. Everything seemed ordinary at first. The peeling wallpaper, the slightly squeaky floors, the familiar layout of the living room and kitchen. I spent the first few days unpacking and arranging my belongings, trying to make the space my own. But then, small oddities began to emerge that I initially brushed off as quirks of an old building. It started with my favorite armchair. One evening, as I returned from a late shift, I noticed it was not in the exact spot where I'd left it. I distinctly remembered setting it against the far wall in the living room. Yet now it sat right in the center, as if placed there by someone with an inexplicable purpose. I checked every room, wondering if I'd inadvertently moved it in a half-asleep haze. But no, my memory was clear. Then I found a folded note tucked between the cushions, with a message scrawled in hurried handwriting. Everything changes. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to tell myself it was just a prank or a stray message left by a previous tenant. The next day, while I was preparing dinner, I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was the same clock that had hung there since I moved in, yet the numbers appeared slightly off, 1 minute behind, as if time itself were lagging. I laughed nervously at my own overreaction, attributing it to the stress of settling in. But the changes weren't confined to the furniture or clocks. Over the following week, small details began to shift almost imperceptibly. A photograph that I'd hung above the mantel, one that I'd carefully chosen and placed, was now crooked, its frame rotated by a few degrees. A painting that had always been on the left wall in the hallway was now on the right, and when I tried to put it back, it slipped through my fingers as if it were wet with invisible condensation. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe I was just exhausted, or perhaps the dim lighting was distorting my perception. Yet, the next morning as I left for work, I noticed something even stranger. The doormat outside my door, a faded rectangle with a cheerful "Welcome home," now bore a different message. Scratched into the rubber were the words, "You can't leave." I stared at it in disbelief, my heart pounding in my ears, but when I mentioned it to a neighbor in passing, they merely smiled politely and said, "It's always been that way, hasn't it?" Their eyes, however, seemed to hold a secret I couldn't quite decipher. As days turned into weeks, the changes grew more insistent. Every time I returned home, it was as if the apartment had been subtly rearranged. Objects would be found in places where I was sure I hadn't left them. The coffee mug I always placed on the kitchen counter was sometimes on the dining table, sometimes near the door. Even my favorite bookshelf seemed to shift its position ever so slightly. as if guided by an unseen hand. I started keeping a journal, recording each discrepancy, each moment when the apartment wasn't exactly as I remembered. Yet when I compared my notes from one day to the next, it was as if reality itself was rewriting the details. Events I had documented would suddenly be contradicted by what I saw later. One particularly unsettling evening, after a long day filled with these inexplicable changes, I sat in my living room trying to relax. The soft hum of the city outside felt comforting, a constant in a sea of shifting details. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My laptop, which I'd left open on the desk, now displayed a folder named Loop that I swore I had never created. Inside were dozens of images of my apartment, each one taken at different times, but with subtle variations. The armchair in a different spot, a window slightly ajar that I was sure I'd closed, even the color of the walls seeming a shade off. It was as if someone had been watching me, documenting every tiny change, curating my life like a series of experiments. I began to feel increasingly isolated, as if I were the only one aware of these glitches. When I tried to discuss my experiences with friends, they dismissed them as stress-induced paranoia. "Your apartment is old," one said, "and you're just imagining things." But deep down, I knew there was something far more sinister at work. I started avoiding my apartment, venturing out into the city where, for a brief time, I felt normal. Yet every time I returned home, I was met with a place that was both familiar and utterly alien. One night, unable to bear the mounting unease any longer, I decided to confront it. I sat in the middle of my living room, the silence around me heavy and oppressive, and spoke aloud. "What do you want from me?" The words hung in the air, unanswered. I felt as though the walls were listening, and for a split second, I thought I saw a flicker of movement behind the curtains, a shadow that wasn't there before. It wasn't a threat, not overtly, but it was a silent acknowledgement that I was caught in something far beyond my control. Now, as I write these words in the fading light of another day, I am overwhelmed by a sense of entrapment. The apartment, once a haven of comfort and stability, has become a labyrinth of shifting realities. I no longer know what to trust. The placement of a chair, the message on the doormat, even my own memories seem unreliable. I have come to dread the moment I step through the door, unsure of what version of my home I will find waiting for me. The changes are no longer random. They feel deliberate, as if I am trapped in a loop or an alternate reality designed to keep me questioning what is real. I have started to wonder if my life is nothing more than a series of programmed iterations, each day a slight variation on the last, manipulated by forces beyond my understanding. The familiar has become untrustworthy, and I can no longer distinguish between what I once knew and what is being subtly altered around me. In a way, I fear I have become part of this endless cycle, a character in a script that rewrites itself every time I blink. And as the glitches multiply, I'm left with the terrifying realization that the reality I once cherished may have been nothing more than an illusion. No matter how hard I try to reclaim normalcy, I am perpetually caught in a maze of inexplicable changes with no exit in sight. I never believed I was losing my grip on reality, until the small, unexplainable moments began to accumulate like dust in a forgotten corner. It started subtly enough. A misplaced umbrella that I swore I'd left in the hallway, only to discover it later in my car, wet with condensation as if it had been stored there all along. I told myself it was nothing more than an absent-minded error, a simple lapse brought on by long work days and sleepless nights. But then, over the course of several weeks, the coincidences grew too frequent, too detailed to ignore. One rainy afternoon, while returning home from a routine errand, I noticed a man standing across the street, partially hidden by a cluster of trees. His face was oddly familiar, a face I couldn't place despite being sure I hadn't seen him before. But what unsettled me most was the way he watched me with an intensity that bordered on recognition. I waved in a vague greeting, and he merely nodded before disappearing into the drizzle. Later that day, while scrolling through old photos, I thought I recognized that man in the background of a picture taken years ago, at a family picnic. My heart pounded as I questioned whether I was misremembering, or if someone I'd never met was somehow intruding on my past. At home, everyday objects began to behave in ways that defied logic. A set of keys I always left on the kitchen counter would inexplicably vanish and reappear in different spots around the apartment. A book I had been reading one evening, left open on the coffee table, was later found closed and turned to a page I had never read before. I started to wonder if I was simply too tired, if my mind was playing tricks on me. I began keeping a journal, meticulously noting every odd occurrence in the hopes that patterns might emerge, a rational explanation for the inexplicable. I recorded the sudden chill that descended upon me when I passed by a particular hallway, the sound of a faint lullaby drifting through my apartment late at night, and the inexplicable reflection of a figure in the dark window of the building across the street. Sleep, once a refuge from the day's mundanity, became a battleground of surreal dreams and disquieting half-memories. In my dreams, I encountered a shadowed figure whose eyes held a mix of sorrow and knowing, a presence that whispered my name in tones both soothing and sinister. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing, only to find that the familiar comfort of my bedroom had subtly changed, as if I were no longer in the place I had always known. Even during the day, I'd catch fleeting glimpses of movement in the corners of my vision, a flash of someone standing in the corridor, a figure walking past the window that wasn't there a moment before. My friends, when I tried to explain, insisted that I must be overreacting, that stress and too many late nights were clouding my judgment. The turning point came one evening when, as I sat in my dimly lit living room, I heard a series of soft knocks echoing from the wall. They were measured, deliberate, as if someone were tapping out a message. I approached the wall cautiously, pressing my ear against its cool surface, but only heard a low, rhythmic hum. I recorded the sound, hoping that a careful analysis would yield a logical explanation. A faulty pipe, perhaps, or the settling of the old building. But when I played the recording back, the hum was interspersed with faint, indecipherable whispers that sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't tell if it was a trick of the recording equipment or something else entirely. Over time, every anomaly chipped away at the certainty of my own sanity. The world I once took for granted felt like a stage set up for a performance in which I was both the audience and the unwilling participant. I began to wonder if I was the only one perceiving these oddities, if perhaps I was destined to see a hidden layer of reality that everyone else simply overlooked. My journal grew thick with entries detailing objects that moved on their own, sounds that echoed with hidden meaning, and faces that seemed to materialize from memory and vanish just as quickly. Friends and acquaintances offered polite reassurances, yet none could witness what I experienced firsthand. Now, as I sit alone in my apartment, the line between what is real and what might be a figment of my imagination has blurred to a point of complete uncertainty. I've retraced my steps, rewatched the grainy videos, and listened to the distorted recordings, but every rational explanation dissolves in the face of these accumulating mysteries. I find myself haunted by the possibility that there is a deeper truth hidden beneath the veneer of everyday life, a truth that I am not meant to understand, or perhaps that I'm not meant to perceive at all. With every knock on the wall, every misplaced object, every fleeting glimpse of a familiar stranger, I feel the unsettling pressure of unanswered questions bearing down on me. Am I truly witnessing something beyond the ordinary? Or is it simply my mind constructing elaborate illusions from the shadows of isolation and fatigue? I have no answers, only the relentless persistence of these moments that refuse to fade. And as I sit here in the dim glow of a flickering lamp, I can't help but wonder if, in the end, the only certainty is that nothing is ever as it seems. It started on a day that seemed completely ordinary, until it didn't. I woke up, as I always did, to the sound of my alarm and the pale light of dawn streaming through my curtains. But that morning, something felt off, as if I'd slept through an hour I wasn't meant to remember. I went about my routine, showered, dressed, and made a cup of coffee. But there was a nagging emptiness, a void where my usual recollections should have been. I shrugged it off, assuming I'd simply overslept, until small anomalies began to multiply. At work, I noticed that colleagues greeted me in ways that felt strangely rehearsed. One coworker, whom I'd known for years, complimented my new style in a tone that implied we'd discussed it before, even though I had never changed a thing about my appearance. Later, during lunch, I found myself unable to recall a conversation I was certain had taken place. And when I tried to bring it up, my friends insisted nothing unusual had happened. It was as if my very actions were being edited out of existence, leaving behind only a fragment of what should have been. That evening, on my drive home, I realized I had lost time. The route I took was familiar, yet I distinctly remembered a detour, a side street, a quick stop that I couldn't account for when I arrived home. When I checked my phone, the timestamps didn't match up with my recollection. I felt a creeping dread, not from something happening around me, but from a deep, internal void where my memories should be. In the following days, the sensation of missing time evolved into something far more sinister. I began waking up in places I didn't remember going. I'd find myself outside in the middle of the night, clothes on, but no recollection of leaving my apartment, and my phone would display images from my surroundings that I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the time that was stolen. It was parts of my day, bits of conversation, and even snippets of actions that were erased from my mind. I started to feel as though an unseen force was slowly rewriting my life. The changes weren't limited to my own experiences. People around me started to behave differently too. My best friend, who used to be gregarious and warm, would suddenly appear distant, as if he'd forgotten our shared history. He'd reference events in our past in a way that conflicted with what I remembered, leaving me questioning whether I was the one who had changed or if something else was altering everything. Even the simplest interactions began to feel like carefully rehearsed lines in a play that I no longer understood. One particularly unsettling night, I sat in my living room, watching old home videos for comfort. As I scrolled through the footage, I noticed something impossible. A moment when I was laughing with friends, smiling and carefree, was abruptly interrupted by a pause, a gap in the recording. The video skipped, as if the camera had been reset, and when it resumed, the laughter was gone, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. I rewound it several times, certain that I had missed a crucial detail, but each time, it played back with that inexplicable gap. It wasn't long before I began to suspect that these glitches in my memory and the behavior of those around me were not random. I started to document every odd occurrence. The conversations that seemed to have missing pieces, the detours in my day that I couldn't account for, the way my actions felt automated, like I was following a script written by someone else. My journal filled with entries that contradicted one another, moments that I was sure I had lived through altered by time and circumstance. I began to feel trapped inside my own mind, a spectator watching as my life was quietly edited without my consent. I sought help from a therapist, explaining that I felt as though my days were being hijacked by an invisible force, that I was losing pieces of myself one moment at a time. But even she struggled to understand the depth of my terror. "It sounds like dissociative episodes," she said, urging me to rest and keep a record of my feelings. Yet even as she spoke, I knew deep down that it wasn't just a matter of mental health. It was as though someone or something was pulling the strings from the shadows. Then, one night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I felt an overwhelming presence in the room, a cold, insidious awareness that I wasn't alone, not physically but within my own mind. I heard a faint whisper, or perhaps it was just my own thoughts echoing, saying, "You are not in control." The words reverberated through me, and I realized with a paralyzing certainty that the phenomenon wasn't just about lost time or altered behavior. It was about control. Someone was controlling the flow of my memories, the fabric of my actions, rewriting reality from within. Now, as I write this, I cannot shake the feeling that I am merely a puppet in a vast, unknowable experiment, a series of carefully orchestrated glitches that erase and rewrite my every decision. I lie awake in the dark, haunted by the thought that the next moment might be the one where I lose myself entirely. I have no answers, only a relentless, gnawing terror that the true nature of my reality has been subverted by forces beyond my understanding. And as I watch the shadows on my wall, I can't help but feel that somewhere, out there, someone or something is still watching, still controlling, and that I may never reclaim the simple, unaltered life I once knew. It started with something so minor, I almost didn't register it. I had just moved into a new apartment. Nothing fancy, just a small unit in a quiet complex on the edge of town. The neighbors seemed polite, but kept to themselves, which was fine by me. I like my privacy. The first odd thing happened on my second night. I came home late from work, set my keys down on the kitchen counter like I always do, and went to take a shower. When I came back, the keys were gone. I searched everywhere, growing increasingly frustrated, only to find them sitting neatly by the front door, as if someone had placed them there on purpose. I told myself I must have absent-mindedly moved them, though I couldn't remember doing so. Then I started noticing other small things. My closet door slightly ajar when I knew I had shut it. The bathroom light on when I swore I had turned it off. It wasn't enough to alarm me, but a nagging feeling of unease settled in my stomach. My sleep became restless, filled with half-dreams of footsteps in my apartment, of whispers just beyond my hearing. But every morning, I woke up to find everything in place, the night's anxieties fading into the background of routine. One evening, I ran into my downstairs neighbor, Mrs. Calloway, an older woman who had lived in the building for over a decade. She was friendly enough, asking how I was settling in. I joked about my misplaced keys, expecting her to laugh, but instead, her expression darkened. "You keep an eye on that," she said quietly, almost as if she was warning me. Before I could ask what she meant, she simply smiled again and shuffled away. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling that something was wrong grew stronger. A few nights later, I woke up abruptly to the sound of my apartment door handle rattling. My stomach dropped. I held my breath, heart hammering as I listened. The sound stopped after a moment, but I stayed frozen, straining to hear any other movement outside my door. Eventually, I convinced myself that it was just a neighbor passing by, maybe someone accidentally brushing against my door. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The real turning point came about a week later. I had been at work all day and returned home to find my bedroom window unlocked. It was on the second floor, and I never opened it. Panic flared in my chest. I searched the apartment, checking every closet, every dark corner, but I was alone. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, that someone had stood in my room, touching my things. I called the building manager, but he dismissed my concerns, saying the previous tenant probably just left it unlocked, and I hadn't noticed before. That night, I locked everything, double-checked the windows, bolted the door. But sleep didn't come easily. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a soft scraping sound, like something dragging along the floor. My body went rigid. I reached for my phone, barely breathing, and strained to listen. The sound moved closer, stopping just outside my bedroom door. I sat up, my fingers gripping the blankets, feeling utterly trapped. Then silence. The longest, most suffocating silence I had ever endured. Minutes passed, maybe longer, before I finally got the courage to turn on my bedside lamp. I forced myself to get up, heart pounding, and slowly opened the door. Nothing. My apartment was empty. I barely slept that night. And the next morning, I decided I needed to get out of that apartment. I called my friend, Sam, and asked if I could stay at his place for a while. He agreed, no questions asked. Before leaving, I knocked on Mrs. Calloway's door, hoping she could tell me more about the building. She opened it just a crack, her eyes filled with something I can only describe as regret. "You're leaving, aren't you?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Mrs. Calloway, has anything like this happened before?" She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if making sure no one else was listening. "They don't like it when people notice," she whispered. A chill ran down my spine. "Who?" But she just shook her head and closed the door. I packed my things and left that evening. I didn't even stay one more night. Sam let me crash on his couch while I looked for a new place, and I tried to put everything behind me. But then, about a week later, he handed me his phone with a weird look on his face. "You left something behind," he said. Confused, I looked at the screen. It was a message from an unknown number, just 2 words: come back. Attached was a photo of my apartment door, taken from inside the building. I never went back. I don't know who or what was in that apartment with me, but I know, without a doubt, that someone had been watching me the entire time, and they knew exactly when I left. I first noticed something off when I met him at the community barbecue last summer. I'd never seen him before, yet he blended in effortlessly, a friendly face among many new neighbors. His name was Daniel, and his initial charm was disarming. He asked innocuous questions about where I worked and what brought me to the neighborhood, and his compliments felt sincere as he remarked on my taste in music and even the way I laughed. At first, I chalked it up to someone simply being nice, a quiet effort to break the ice. But as the weeks passed, those seemingly harmless exchanges began to accumulate into a series of unsettling encounters. It started with little things, a remark here, a question there that left me with a prickle of unease. One afternoon, while I was leaving a local coffee shop, Daniel appeared at the door. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He lingered for a moment, asking details about my morning routine, as if he needed to know every small aspect of my day. I excused myself quickly, feeling that inexplicable tug at the back of my mind urging me to be cautious. The compliments, once charming, began to sound overly personal. "You have such a calming presence," he'd say, and then pause as though studying me for a moment too long. At first, I tried to dismiss these encounters as coincidences or mere quirks of a friendly neighbor. I even found myself laughing off his awkward attempts at humor during our occasional chats in the hallway. But soon, I began to notice details that I couldn't ignore. On several evenings, I'd return home to find my front door slightly ajar, even though I was sure I had locked it. Personal items would be moved, a book placed in a different spot on my shelf, a picture frame turned at an odd angle. When I mentioned these small disturbances to friends, they brushed them off as nothing more than absent-mindedness on my part. Yet, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. One rainy night, while waiting for the bus, I caught sight of Daniel across the street. He stood under a flickering street lamp, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. His posture was unnervingly still, as if he were studying me like a puzzle. I hurried onto the bus, my heart pounding, trying desperately to convince myself that I was overreacting. But the sense of dread lingered, as if I were caught in the grip of something far more menacing than a harmless neighborly chat. Over time, his behavior became increasingly intrusive. During a neighborhood association meeting, Daniel asked oddly specific questions about my personal life, questions I hadn't even offered answers to before. "I noticed you always leave your window open at night," he observed casually, as though that were common knowledge. "Do you find it helps you sleep better?" His tone was gentle, but the implication was disturbing. I began to feel as though my privacy was being invaded, as if someone was meticulously cataloging the intimate details of my daily life. I started to record our conversations in my mind, piecing together every detail that might explain his intentions. But the more I tried to rationalize his actions, the more the dissonance grew. The turning point came on a chilly evening in early autumn. I was returning from a late shift when I saw him again, standing under a street lamp outside my apartment building. This time, his smile was replaced with something more sinister, a cold, calculating look. "I was just wondering if you needed any help getting home," he said, his voice soft and measured. I politely declined and hurried inside, but the encounter left me shaken. Once behind my locked door, I realized that the minor disturbances and unsettling compliments had escalated into a palpable threat. It wasn't just his relentless questions. It was the way he seemed to know things about me that I hadn't shared, as though he were gathering evidence of my routines and vulnerabilities. In the days that followed, I changed my schedule, altered my routes, and even considered moving. Yet every time I thought I'd escaped his influence, I caught sight of his familiar figure lurking in the periphery, at the local grocery store, in the park, or even through the glass of a passing car. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was always one step behind, his presence a constant, unsettling reminder that my life was no longer entirely my own. I confided in a friend about the mounting unease, but his reaction was mixed with disbelief and concern. Maybe you're reading too much into things, he said, though I saw the worry in his eyes. Now, as I write this, I remain haunted by the memory of Daniel's unnerving intensity and the slow erosion of my sense of security. I find myself glancing over my shoulder in crowded places, questioning every unexpected compliment and every polite inquiry. My once peaceful routine has been invaded by a shadow of suspicion, a realization that sometimes the face of friendliness can conceal a deeper, more controlling intent. I still see him sometimes, just at the edge of my vision, always watching, always waiting. And I can't help but wonder, was he truly dangerous, a subtle predator who slipped into my life unnoticed? Or have I simply overestimated the oddities of his behavior? The answer remains as elusive as his smile, a mystery that haunts me in every quiet moment, leaving me to question whether this unsettling encounter was the product of a troubled mind or a real threat lurking behind the mask of neighborly courtesy. I moved into a modest apartment on the edge of town after a messy breakup, hoping that a fresh start in a quieter place might mend my frayed nerves. The building was old, with creaky floorboards and faded wallpaper that hinted at decades of forgotten stories. At first, everything seemed ordinary. A few unfurnished rooms, a small kitchen with outdated appliances, and a narrow hallway lined with dusty portraits of unknown faces. I told myself it was merely the ambience of an aging structure, nothing more than the typical quirks of an old building. Within the first week, however, I began noticing small oddities that I could almost rationalize away. My keys, which I distinctly remembered placing on the entry table, would occasionally vanish, only to be found later in inexplicable corners of the apartment. Doors that I was sure I had closed would sometimes be left ajar, and on one rainy evening, I caught a glimpse of what I assumed was a trick of the light, a shadow passing by my bedroom window. I chalked it up to my exhausted mind and the unfamiliar layout of my new home. Still, a nagging unease persisted. A few nights later, while unpacking in the living room, I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the corridor. It was soft at first, like the persistent patter of raindrops, but distinct against the otherwise hushed silence of the building. I rationalized it as a loose shutter flapping in the wind, yet the sound recurred with uncanny regularity, always at the same time each night. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I set up an old digital recorder on the windowsill, convinced that logic would eventually reveal a mundane cause. Perhaps the wind or even distant construction noises. For several nights, the recorder captured nothing beyond the ordinary hum of the old building. Then, one night, as I sat huddled in my armchair with a book, the tapping resumed. This time, interlaced with the tapping were faint murmurs, low, almost indecipherable voices that seemed to speak in a language I couldn't recognize. I replayed the recording over and over, trying to isolate any discernible words, but each attempt left me with more questions than answers. Was it the wind? A neighbor's TV left on at a low volume? Or was something else at work entirely? The next morning, spurred by a mix of curiosity and growing dread, I began keeping a meticulous journal of every strange occurrence. I recorded times, sounds, and even the sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature that sometimes enveloped the apartment. The digital thermometer I kept on my bedside table would occasionally plummet by nearly 15 degrees, even though the thermostat stubbornly read a steady 70 degrees Fahrenheit. I scoured online forums and local historical archives, trying to connect the dots, but every rational explanation seemed to crumble under the weight of the evidence I was gathering. Local lore, I discovered, spoke of the building's grim past. Constructed in the early 1900s, it had once been part of a small settlement rumored to be cursed, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead was alarmingly thin. I dismissed such stories as superstitious drivel at first. Surely, creaky floors and inexplicable sounds could be explained by aging infrastructure, faulty wiring, or even the eccentricities of previous tenants. Yet, the precise timing of the disturbances and the spectral quality of the recorded voices made it increasingly difficult to cling solely to rational explanations. One evening, determined to capture indisputable evidence, I rigged my apartment with an array of recording devices, cameras, and even makeshift sensors to track temperature fluctuations. As midnight approached, the devices registered a series of anomalies. Sudden, sharp drops in temperature, erratic bursts of static on the audio recordings, and that familiar rhythmic tapping echoing through every room. My heart pounded as I watched the monitor displaying overlapping sensor data that defied all logic. I even glimpsed on one of the grainy video clips a fleeting shadow darting just out of the camera's focus, too quick and too deliberate to be dismissed as a trick of the light. I decided to share my findings with a small group of friends and even a local paranormal investigator recommended on an online forum. Over a weekend gathering in the apartment, my friends were skeptical, attributing the oddities to the building's natural decay or to my own overactive imagination. The investigator, a reserved man with a scientific bent, examined the recordings and sensor data only to shake his head in bafflement. "There's nothing here that fits any known pattern," he admitted, leaving me with a disquieting mixture of validation and further uncertainty. The disturbances grew bolder with each passing night. One morning, I awoke to find my kitchen table arranged with a series of rusted trinkets, forming an unmistakable pattern, one that resembled an ancient symbol I had seen in one of the historical books I'd borrowed from the local library. On another occasion, I discovered a handwritten note smeared on my bathroom mirror in scrawled ink. "You are not alone." The handwriting was erratic, almost desperate, and I spent hours scouring online databases and local records for any trace of its origin, to no avail. Sleep became a rare visitor as vivid dreams began to haunt my nights. Dreams of a shadowy figure with indistinct features, silently watching from the periphery of my vision, leading me down endless corridors that ended in absolute darkness. I awoke in a cold sweat, the memory of those dreams clinging to me like a shroud. In the daylight, I tried to convince myself that stress and isolation were distorting my perceptions, yet the evidence I had meticulously documented insisted otherwise. Now, as I sit here documenting these events, I am plagued by one final, unanswered question. Was it all a cruel trick of my mind, or did I indeed open a door to something that lurks just beyond the threshold of normalcy? Each new day brings fragments of evidence that defy logical explanation, and every night, I brace myself for the inevitable return of those inexplicable sounds and shifting shadows. I have learned to live with uncertainty, though it gnaws at my need for a neat conclusion. The apartment remains as it was, quiet and unassuming on the surface. Yet I know that beneath its ordinary facade lies a mystery far more complex than I ever imagined. In the stillness before dawn, when the world is asleep, I often wonder if the truth is simply too overwhelming for human minds to fathom. My search for logic has only deepened the enigma, leaving me to grapple with the unsettling possibility that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Until someone else picks up where I left off, I am trapped between the comfort of reason and the chilling allure of the unknown, haunted by questions that may never find answers. It began on an unremarkable Tuesday, the kind of day that should have passed without incident. I'd woken up to the usual routine: coffee brewing, the soft hum of the air conditioner, and the reassuring monotony of my morning commute. But as I boarded the train that morning, I noticed something off. A man in a well-worn leather jacket was sitting across from me, reading a newspaper with an intensity that bordered on obsession. His eyes flickered over the headlines before darting up to meet mine with a look that was both curious and unsettling. I dismissed it as a random glance, a fleeting moment that meant nothing. I had no idea that this encounter would mark the beginning of something inexplicable. Over the next few days, I began to experience small, strange anomalies. At work, I was introduced to a new colleague, someone I'd never met before, named Oliver. He was amiable and seemed to know every little detail about the office, even some of the informal stories that no one else recalled. When I mentioned to another coworker that Oliver had told me about the history of our office building, she looked at me as if I were mistaken. "Oliver? We've never had anyone by that name here," she said. I assumed I was confused. Perhaps his name was similar to someone else's, and I let it slide. Yet that evening, on my drive home, I passed by a cafe and saw the same man from the train sitting at a table outside, as if waiting for someone. He was wearing the same leather jacket, but today his eyes were a different color, shifting from blue to a murky green with each blink. I felt an odd pull, a certainty that he wasn't just an ordinary stranger. Then the glitches started to escalate. One afternoon, I returned to my apartment after a long day at work, only to find my front door slightly ajar. I distinctly remembered locking it that morning. Inside, everything was as it should be, except for one glaring detail. My watch, which I had set on the kitchen table, now displayed a time that was off by nearly an hour. I checked every other clock in the apartment. They all confirmed the same time. I couldn't tell if it was a malfunction or if time itself had somehow slipped away. I chalked it up to a faulty device and reset the time, but the unsettling feeling remained. In the following weeks, these occurrences grew both in frequency and in peculiarity. I began to notice that my perception of time was becoming unreliable. There were days when I'd step out for a walk and return home, only to find that hours had passed in what felt like mere minutes. Sometimes I'd catch myself staring at the same scene on the street corner twice in one day, like I had somehow looped back to a moment that should have been long gone. I started to keep a journal, meticulously noting every detail. The time I left, the time I returned, even the smallest deviations in routine. Yet no matter how hard I tried to pin it down, the entries themselves began to feel as if they were shifting. Dates and events I was certain had occurred seemed to change places or vanish entirely when I read them back. One evening, while reading an old entry, I realized with a jolt that the description of a conversation with a friend was entirely different from what I remembered. In my recollection, he had joked about an upcoming concert, but in the journal, the tone was somber, and he mentioned a missed opportunity, details that did not align with any shared memory. The more I tried to reconcile these differences, the more I began to doubt the very foundation of my memories. It was as though my past was being rewritten, subtly altered by an unseen force. The strangest incident occurred on a rainy night when I left my apartment to meet a friend for dinner. I distinctly recalled locking the door behind me. Yet as I walked down the dimly lit street, I saw my door swinging open in the breeze. I hurried back to check, but it was securely shut, as if nothing had happened. At the restaurant, I noticed a peculiar pattern. The same man in the leather jacket appeared in reflections, on polished surfaces, in dark windows, and even on the glossy tabletop of the bar. Each time I saw him, his appearance was slightly different. His face would change expression, his jacket would appear worn in one moment and pristine the next, and his eyes would shift hue unpredictably. I tried to mention it to my friend, but he simply smiled and said, "You're seeing things, man. It's just the rain playing tricks." I started to feel increasingly isolated in my experience. When I brought up these glitches at work, colleagues brushed them off as stress-induced hallucinations. My friends, too, reassured me that I was overthinking it, a case of déjà vu amplified by exhaustion. But deep down, I couldn't shake the conviction that something was fundamentally wrong with the fabric of reality. I wasn't imagining these things. They were happening, and they were escalating in subtle, yet unmistakable ways. Now every day feels like a puzzle with missing pieces. I walk through the city, eyes scanning for anomalies. A street sign that shifts its letters, a storefront that appears to have moved just slightly, a face in the crowd that I swear I've seen before, only to vanish when I try to get a better look. My journal is filled with entries that contradict one another, and the more I document, the more I feel as though I'm becoming entangled in a web of shifting timelines and fragmented memories. Tonight, as I sit in my apartment watching the rain blur the city lights, I can't help but feel that I'm no longer in control of my own reality. Every glitch, every inexplicable change, hints at something far greater, a malfunction in the very code of existence. I've become part of this anomaly, trapped in a loop where the past and present, the real and the imagined, are all colliding into one incomprehensible mosaic. I now wonder if the reality I once knew was ever truly real, or if it was merely an illusion, a neatly packaged construct that has finally unraveled. As the rain continues to fall, I realize with a quiet terror that I may never return to the world I once believed in. Instead, I'm left to navigate this shifting, uncertain landscape, forever a glitch in a matrix that refuses to remain stable. I woke up to an ordinary morning, the familiar chime of my alarm, the soft hum of my coffee maker, and the predictable routine of my daily commute. Yet, as I stepped outside, I felt a slight dissonance, as if the world around me was missing a beat. At first, it was the small things, a streetlight that flickered in a pattern that wasn't quite right, or a lamppost whose shadow stretched in a direction that defied the angle of the rising sun. I chalked it up to my still sleepy mind playing tricks on me. On the bus, I glanced around and saw a man in a red coat, someone I was sure I hadn't noticed before. But as the bus rolled through the city, I kept catching fleeting glimpses of him. He was always there, standing at the same stop, then disappearing just as mysteriously as he appeared. The first time, I assumed he was simply a local commuter. The second time, I wondered if I was mistaken. But by the third encounter, a nagging thought took root. Had I seen him before, or was he repeating himself like a broken loop? At work, things grew stranger still. I walked into the break room and saw my usual seating arrangement completely rearranged. The table where I normally sat was replaced by another that I distinctly remembered leaving untouched yesterday. My colleagues offered polite smiles, but when I mentioned the change, they shook their heads and insisted nothing was different. They even laughed when I described the way my coffee cup had been moved from its usual spot to the edge of the counter. Yet, as I stood there, I felt the undeniable tug of déjà vu, as if I were in a world that was slowly rewriting itself without my permission. In the evening, while taking my regular shortcut through the park, I saw something that made my blood run cold. I passed the same familiar bench. Only this time, the worn wood had a pattern I'd never seen before, almost like a series of scratches that spelled out a message I couldn't decipher. Nearby, a woman feeding pigeons looked up and smiled at me, but her eyes held an expression of knowing emptiness. "Good evening," she said softly, though I was sure we had never spoken before. I offered a tentative nod and hurried on, feeling the pulse of the park's rhythm warp around me. Over the following days, these inexplicable glitches became a constant companion. I began to notice that everyday objects seemed to shift positions when I wasn't looking. A book on the coffee table that moved to the shelf overnight, a painting on the wall that subtly rotated its angle from one day to the next. Even my phone's wallpaper, which I had chosen so deliberately, appeared altered with an image that was almost identical, yet slightly off. The same phenomenon occurred with people. Strangers I'd greeted in the morning would later reappear in the same place, as if following an unspoken script, their conversations repeating with minor variations that sent chills down my spine. Curiosity turned into resignation as I started recording every detail in a notebook. I jotted down times, locations, and every minute anomaly. The more I documented, the more I realized a disturbing pattern emerging, one of repetition and inconsistency that blurred the line between normal life and a malfunctioning reality. It was as if the world was caught in a loop, and every time I blinked, the scene was reset, with tiny glitches added like digital static in the background. One late night, as I sat in my dimly lit living room, I noticed something that forced me to confront the possibility that I might already be trapped. The clock on the wall, a relic from my childhood, was ticking at an irregular pace, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, almost as if it were skipping frames in a film. I reached out to steady it, but my hand passed through a subtle shimmer that made me question whether the object was even there at all. My heart pounded as the realization sank in. My surroundings were no longer governed by the immutable laws I'd always taken for granted. I began to wonder if I was the only one perceiving these glitches, or if the world around me had been altered fundamentally. I called friends and family, describing what I saw, but they responded with disbelief and laughter, assuring me that I must be overworked or imagining things. Even my colleagues at work seemed oblivious to the small distortions in our routine. Their eyes met mine with the same practiced normalcy, as if nothing had changed at all. In a moment of desperate clarity, I revisited the park one final time. I sat on that same bench, now etched with the mysterious scratches, and watched as the world repeated itself in an endless loop. The man in the red coat appeared once more, his presence both a comfort and a warning. I realized then that the glitches weren't just anomalies, they were fundamental shifts in reality. The repetition was not accidental. It was as if the very fabric of existence was being rewritten, and I was caught in the middle. Now, as I sit in my apartment, a place that feels less like home and more like a stage for an endless rerun, I know that nothing will ever be the same. I've become part of a cycle, an unintentional glitch in a system I can no longer understand. Every day, the familiar becomes alien, and every moment holds the potential for a subtle shift, a misplaced object, a repeated face, a time that doesn't align. I've tried to hold on to what was once normal, but the more I cling to it, the more it slips away, leaving behind only fragments of a reality that seems to be dissolving before my eyes. I've come to accept that the world I once knew may be lost forever, replaced by a broken simulation where continuity and change are inextricably intertwined. In the quiet of the night, as I stare at the flickering lights outside my window, I can't help but wonder, have I become nothing more than a glitch in the matrix, trapped in a loop of endless repetition? And if so, is there any escape from a reality that no longer feels real? The thought haunts me, a silent reminder that perhaps the truth isn't out there to be fixed. It's built into the very code of existence, and I am forever a part of its unraveling. I first began noticing something was off during a late night when I couldn't recall how I ended up in bed. I woke with a vague sense of disorientation, as if hours had been stolen from me, but brushed it aside as sleep deprivation. Over the following weeks, small lapses began to mount. One morning, I found a note scribbled on my bathroom mirror in shaky handwriting. "You are not alone." I remember being startled, yet when I mentioned it to my roommate, he simply said I must have written it myself in a half-asleep moment. I wasn't convinced. Then the unexplained began seeping into my everyday life. I started missing chunks of time. I'd leave for work and later check my phone to find a series of messages I didn't recall sending. Sometimes I'd return home to discover my keys placed on the kitchen counter, even though I was sure I'd left them on the hall table. At first, I assumed I was just being forgetful. After all, stress can do that. But as the days went by, the feeling that my actions were not entirely my own grew stronger. One evening, while making dinner, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window, a momentary flash where my eyes looked distant, as if someone else were staring back. I felt a chill run down my spine and hastily turned away. That night, I awoke to a soft, insistent whisper that I could not place, a sound that seemed to come from deep inside me. I lay there, paralyzed, as the whisper repeated, "Let go." I forced myself back to sleep, but the words clung to me like a shadow. As if that weren't enough, my interactions with people began to shift in ways I couldn't understand. Conversations with friends would take on entirely new tones the next day. Comments they never made before, jokes I didn't remember sharing. One close friend insisted that I had told him something deeply personal, a secret I had no recollection of uttering. Every time I confronted him about it, he would smile reassuringly and claim it was all in jest. But I knew something was very wrong. Desperate for control, I started keeping a detailed journal. I recorded every odd occurrence. The times when I lost track of minutes, the sudden changes in my behavior that felt imposed rather than chosen. Yet even the journal betrayed me. I would read an entry I was sure I had written one way, only to find that the words had been subtly altered, my private thoughts twisted into something ominous like, "Let go and let us take over." It was as if someone or something was rewriting my past, my actions, my very identity. I began to feel an overwhelming sense of being watched, not by an external presence, but from within myself. There were moments when I'd be driving along a familiar road, only to realize I had no memory of taking a certain turn, as if a part of me had detached and done something on my behalf. I'd return home to find objects repositioned. My glasses placed on a bookshelf instead of the bedside table, a favorite scarf draped over a chair I never sat in. Even the ticking of the clock in my living room started to sound irregular, as though time itself were being manipulated. Late one night, when the silence felt suffocating, I sat in the darkness of my living room and listened to the low hum of the air conditioner. In that stillness, I suddenly became aware of my own heartbeat echoing in my ears, a relentless reminder of my own existence. But then, almost imperceptibly, I heard another heartbeat, a second rhythm that wasn't mine, as if someone else was pacing behind the walls of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that an unseen force was controlling me, nudging me into actions I neither intended nor remembered. When I tried to confide in others, my words were met with pity or outright disbelief. "Maybe you're just stressed," they said. "Are you sure you remember things correctly?" But deep down, I knew that this wasn't just my imagination running wild. The evidence was there in the gaps of my memory, in the altered journal entries, and in the uncanny sensation of being both observer and puppet. I began to dread even the simplest decision, terrified that each choice might be preordained by an external force that stole parts of my life like pieces of a broken puzzle. Now, as I sit in the dim light of my apartment, I can't help but feel that I'm not entirely in control of who I am or what I do. Minutes vanish, conversations distort, and every mirror reflects a stranger's eyes alongside my own. The whispers have not ceased. They have grown louder and more insistent, echoing in the recesses of my mind. I have no answers, only the chilling certainty that something is directing my every move from within. Whether it's a manifestation of my own deteriorating sanity or something far more sinister remains a mystery. One thing is clear: I will never be free of this haunting presence, this feeling that I am being controlled by an unseen force. And so, with every day that passes, I am left wondering if my reality was ever truly mine at all, or if I have always been a puppet dancing to the tune of something much darker than I can ever comprehend. I had always considered myself a cautious person, but nothing had prepared me for the subtle terror that crept into my life when I met Marcus, the new co-worker at our small marketing firm. At first, his easy smile, polite greetings, and seemingly harmless questions about weekend plans and favorite books had put me at ease. In our early interactions, his conversation was light and friendly, nothing more than typical small talk among colleagues. However, as the weeks passed, I began noticing little details that made my skin crawl. It started with questions that felt far too personal. One afternoon, while we were grabbing a quick coffee in the break room, he asked about my family history in a tone that bordered on intrusive. When I mentioned a distant relative who had recently passed away, his eyes lingered a moment too long, and his voice dropped to a hushed, conspiratorial tone, as if he were revealing a secret meant only for me. I tried to dismiss it as a quirk of his personality, but a seed of unease had been planted. Soon, his compliments took on an odd, possessive quality. He would remark on how uniquely fortunate I was to live in such a safe neighborhood, even though I had never expressed any concerns about security. His praise always seemed to come with a hidden undercurrent, as if he were silently staking a claim on my well-being. I began to question whether his interest was genuine camaraderie or something more sinister. One Friday evening, as I stayed late to finish a project, I noticed him lingering by my desk. He leaned in slightly and said in a low voice, "I couldn't help but notice you always double-check your locks. That's smart. Most people leave themselves so vulnerable." His words, framed as an offhand observation, sent a chill down my spine. I forced a smile and replied, "Thanks, I guess I'm just cautious." But inside, my heart pounded with a growing sense of dread. Over the next several days, Marcus's behavior grew increasingly unsettling. During our lunch break in the office cafeteria, he casually inquired if I had any particular routines at home, questions that felt disproportionate to a simple conversation between coworkers. He asked if I ever changed my passwords or if I kept a journal of my daily habits. Each question, though wrapped in the guise of friendly interest, felt invasive, as if he were methodically piecing together details of my private life. I started to notice that his gaze seemed to follow me longer than necessary, and his smile, though pleasant, carried an intensity that made me want to look away. It was as if he were silently cataloging every detail about me, and that thought made my stomach churn. The situation escalated one rainy evening when I was leaving the office late. As I walked to the parking lot, I caught sight of Marcus across the street. Under the dull glow of a flickering streetlight, I saw him leaning against his car, watching me with a fixed, unsettling expression. I quickened my pace, my pulse racing as I fumbled with my keys at the car door. When I finally managed to get inside and lock the doors, I couldn't shake the feeling that his eyes were boring into me, analyzing every movement. That night, as I lay in bed, every creak of my apartment seemed amplified, every shadow in the corner of my eye a potential threat. The next morning brought a new level of disturbance. At work, I discovered a small notebook on my desk that I didn't remember leaving there. Flipping through it, I found scribbled notes about my habits, notes written in a handwriting that looked eerily familiar, as if it belonged to Marcus. My hands trembled as I read phrases like, "He always checks the back door before leaving," and "noticed he prefers the 8:15 bus home." I couldn't shake the feeling that my every move was being monitored. That day, my phone rang at odd intervals. Each time I answered, there was only a faint, static-laced whisper that said, "I'm watching." I reported it to security, but they chalked it up to a malfunctioning line or a prank call. Desperation mounting, I decided to confront Marcus. In the quiet of an empty conference room, I asked him directly, "Marcus, is there something you need to tell me? Lately, your questions and actions feel invasive." For a long, silent moment, he regarded me with an unreadable expression before replying softly, "I'm just trying to understand you better. Isn't that what friends do?" His calm tone and measured smile did little to dispel my rising panic. I left the room feeling more isolated and confused than ever. Was I overreacting, or was there a darker intention behind his seemingly benign interest? Now, as I sit in the dim light of my apartment, I can't help but replay every interaction in my mind. Every friendly compliment and every probing question has taken on a menacing quality. I've taken extra precautions, changing my routines, installing additional locks, even adjusting my work schedule, but the fear remains. I often wonder if my anxiety is distorting reality, making Marcus's behavior appear more sinister than it truly is. Yet, deep down, the memory of his fixed stare and the chilling echo of his whispered words haunt me. I haven't seen him since that confrontation, but I can't shake the sensation that he's still watching, waiting for another opportunity. As I lock my door tonight, I'm left with an unsettling question. Was Marcus merely an overzealous coworker, or have I inadvertently stumbled into a situation where my every move is being observed by someone with far more dangerous intentions than I ever imagined? The uncertainty gnaws at me, and I lie awake wondering if, somewhere in the shadows, his next move is already set in motion. I moved into the apartment on a chilly autumn evening, excited for a fresh start in a building that, at first glance, exuded old-world charm. The landlord had assured me everything was in perfect order, a cozy space with character and plenty of natural light. I spent the first day arranging my few belongings, placing my worn leather armchair by the window, setting my coffee table in front of the couch, and hanging a few family photos on the wall. Everything felt normal, even comforting, like the beginning of a new chapter. But on my second day, I noticed something peculiar. The coffee table, which I was sure I'd left near the couch, was now in the center of the living room. I assumed I had moved it in a moment of distraction, so I returned it to its original spot and shrugged it off as an absent-minded mistake. The following week, subtle changes began to accumulate. I'd come home from work to find a small note taped to my door, handwritten in neat, unfamiliar script, saying only, "We are watching." It wasn't threatening, exactly, but it unsettled me. I asked the landlord about it, but he insisted he'd never seen such a note and that the building security cameras showed no one near my door. I chalked it up to a prank or perhaps an overactive imagination. Yet the next day, as I sipped my morning coffee at the kitchen counter, I saw my favorite mug sitting on the dining table instead. I distinctly remembered placing it on the counter the previous night. It wasn't a big mug, just something I'd picked up at a thrift store, but its disappearance and reappearance in a different spot left me questioning if I was losing track of my own actions. At first, I thought I was just sleep-deprived from the stress of moving. But as days turned into weeks, the changes grew more frequent and harder to dismiss. I began to notice that my apartment's layout seemed to shift ever so slightly whenever I wasn't looking. One evening, after a long day at work, I entered my apartment and was greeted by an oddly arranged bookshelf. I was certain I had left it against the wall, yet now it stood in the middle of the room. When I attempted to put it back, I found it mysteriously resistant, as if it were anchored to the floor in that new position. Other items exhibited similar behavior. A painting that I'd hung on the wall one day was found leaning against a cabinet the next, and the pattern on my rug seemed to have altered ever so imperceptibly, as if redrawn by an unseen hand. I tried to convince myself that I must have been mistaken or that my memory was failing me. My mind, however, grew increasingly unnerved by these repeated discrepancies. I started keeping a detailed journal of every odd occurrence, noting the exact time and position of each item. Yet even the journal began to betray me. I found that sometimes the entries would shift. Details I had recorded one day would be subtly rewritten by the next, as if my recollections were being tampered with. One entry described the note on my door, but in a later reading, the note had been replaced with a different message. Everything is not as it seems. Late one night, unable to sleep, I sat in the darkened living room and listened to the silence. That's when I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible creak coming from the hallway. I rose and walked to the door, heart pounding, only to find nothing out of place. But when I returned to the living room, the armchair had been moved to face the wall instead of the window, a configuration I never arranged. The repetitive, almost ritualistic nature of these changes began to weigh on me. It wasn't just that things were moving. They were rearranging themselves in ways that felt deliberate, as if someone or something was orchestrating the shifts. I started to question my own sanity. I spoke with a few neighbors, and one mentioned that the building sometimes fell off, but no one else had experienced anything as dramatic as I had. The landlord, when confronted again, looked at me with a mixture of pity and confusion, insisting that the apartment had never been altered in any unusual way. Yet I knew what I saw. The consistency of my memories clashed with the current reality of my surroundings, and I began to suspect that my life was caught in some kind of loop or alternate system. The final straw came one morning when I woke up to a scene that defied all logic. I entered the living room expecting the familiar chaos of shifting furniture, only to find everything arranged perfectly as I had left it the previous night. For a moment, relief washed over me, only to be replaced by a creeping dread as I noticed the calendar on the wall. A calendar I was certain I had set to the current date, now displayed a date that was weeks in the past. My heart hammered in my chest as I realized that time itself might be out of sync, that the reality I experienced was fluid and constantly rewriting itself. In that moment, I understood the horrifying truth. I wasn't just dealing with minor rearrangements or forgetful lapses. I was trapped in a closed loop, a shifting alternate reality where every familiar detail could change without warning. The apartment I thought I knew was no longer my home, but a stage for an unfathomable phenomenon that I had no control over. As I stood there, confronting the idea that everything around me was a carefully constructed illusion, one that reset itself over and over, I felt a cold certainty settle over me. The world as I had known it was gone, replaced by a mutable, eerie simulation where nothing remained constant. I was alone, a prisoner in a reality that might have been programmed, and I couldn't tell if it even mattered anymore.